Welcome, everyone. Let's step into the flow of time as we turn another page of history. Wherever you are, whether you're settled in for the night or just taking a moment to rest, your presence is valued. Share your corner of the world in the comments if you wish. If these gentle tales from long ago offer you a sense of calm, I would be honored by your like and subscribe. And now, the story awaits. The Water's False Heart, a tale of the Loch Dhu Kelpie. The Whisper in the Peat. The history of Scotland is not written only in the stone of its castles or the ink of its treaties, but also in the cold, deep water of its lochs and the soft, treacherous ground of its bogs. It is a land where the veil between the world we know and the world of the Asosith, the people of peace, is worn thin, like ancient linen. The wind carries old songs, the hills hold sleeping giants, and the water holds secrets. The most terrible and beautiful of these aquatic secrets is the Kelpie. This shape-shifting spirit of the water, most famed for its equine form, is no simple monster. It is a creature of profound contradiction, a thing of breathtaking beauty and profound desolation, a predator born from loneliness. Its story is one of elemental need and tragic consequence, a legacy written in the tears of grieving mothers and the chilling, empty silence of a loch after a sudden ripple disappears. To understand the Kelpie is to understand the Scottish soul itself, fierce, independent, beautiful, and often haunted by a deep, unquenchable sorrow. Our story begins not with a birth, but with a becoming, in the time when the world was younger and the magic in it was a stronger, more tangible force. The first desolation. The entity that would become the Kelpie did not begin its existence with a name or a defined shape. It was a coalescence, a gathering of raw, untamed emotion that the land itself could no longer contain. It was born in the depths of Loch Dhu, the Black Loch, a body of water so deep and dark it was said to have no bottom, only an endless, cold descent into primordial darkness. The loch lay cradled in a bleak, treeless glen, where the mountains were stark giants against a sky often heavy with bruised clouds. The vibe here was one of profound isolation. The air tasted of wet stone and peat smoke, and the only sounds were the mournful cry of the curlew and the constant whispering lap of water against the shale-strewn shore. It was a place forgotten by time, a place where sorrow could pool and fester. On a day when the rain fell not in drops, but in a sheer, gray curtain, a great tragedy unfolded on the loch's shores. A clan, fleeing a brutal conflict, sought to cross the narrowest point of Loch Dhu in a small, makeshift cobble. The boat, overloaded with weary, desperate people, was caught in a sudden squall. The water, usually so placid, churned into a fury of whitecaps. The wind howled its lament, and the boat was swallowed by the hungry waves. All aboard were lost, men, women, and children, their final screams swallowed by the storm. The grief of that moment was a tangible force. It saturated the very air, seeped into the soil, and most of all, it sank into the deep, cold heart of Loch Dhu. The loch, a passive witness to millennia, absorbed this concentrated essence of human despair, terror, and the final desperate clutch for life. This emotional cataclysm acted like a seed crystal dropped into a supersaturated solution, From the silt and the sorrow, a consciousness began to stir. It was not a soul, not in any human sense, but a sentient echo of that collective demise. It was a being forged from the moment of drowning, and so drowning would become its nature. For decades, it existed as nothing more than a cold spot in the water, a fleeting shadow seen from the corner of the eye, a vague sense of unease that kept the local folk from fishing its depths. It fed on the minor fears of animals, a deer's startled leap from the shore, an otter's wariness. But fear was a thin broth, and the entity hungered for the richer, more potent essence of a sentient soul in its final, terrified moments. Its first attempt at a form was a pathetic, horrifying thing, a shambling, half-shaped mound of waterweed and Loch Dew's dark water, vaguely humanoid but without definition, its surface a shifting mosaic of reflected, despairing faces from the shipwreck. It dragged itself onto the shore one moonless night, its form glistening under the starlight. It saw a lone fisherman, an old man mending his nets by a small fire. The creature felt a pull, a deep, instinctual need for the warmth and life it sensed. It lurched towards the firelight. The old man looked up. His face, initially curious, transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He did not see a monster from legend. He saw the faces of his own grandparents, lost in that long-ago drowning, staring out from the shifting waterweed. He screamed a name, a prayer, and made the sign of the cross. The entity recoiled. The faith, the recognition, the sheer intensity of the man's terror was overwhelming, but it was also painful. It was a raw, jagged energy it did not know how to process. The entity retreated back into the loch, the memory of that failed encounter burning in its nascent mind. It had learned two things. A recognizable, terrifying form was counterproductive, and it needed a shape that was alluring, something that would draw its prey close, something that promised safety and strength. It needed a form that belied its true predatory intent. Over the following years, it studied. It watched the sturdy Highland ponies that sometimes came to drink at the loch's edge. It saw their power, their beauty, the trust they inspired in the men who rode them. It saw how children would run their small hands over their muscular flanks without a trace of fear. This was the perfect deception. The entity began to practice, pulling water and silt and shadow into a new shape. At first, it could only hold the form for a few moments, a shimmering, translucent horse that would collapse back into a splash of dark water. But with each attempt, the form grew more solid, more real. Finally, on a night when the full moon painted a silver road across the black surface of Loch Dew, it succeeded. It emerged from the water not as a shambling horror, but as a creature of breathtaking majesty. It was a stallion, larger than any natural horse, its coat the color of deepest polished jet, reflecting the moonlight with a liquid sheen. Its mane and tail were long and thick, seeming to be made of flowing water itself, perpetually dripping with the cold loch water. Its eyes were the most unnerving feature, a piercing, intelligent green, like chips of glacial ice, holding an ancient and fathomless loneliness. It stood on the shore, testing its new legs. They were strong, powerful. It tossed its head, and the sound that came from it was not a whinny, but something closer to the cry of a loon, eerie and echoing across the silent glen. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was a lie. The Kelpie, now truly a Kelpie, had been born. It was a predator, and its bait was its own magnificent form. It looked towards the distant, warm lights of a croft nestled in the glen, and for the first time it felt not just a hollow hunger, but a dark and certain purpose. The lure was set. The waiting could now begin. The first taking. The first few moons after its transformation were a period of intense learning for the Kelpie. It learned the rhythms of the glen, the comings and goings of the crofters and their animals. It learned to hide its true nature, to stand so still at the water's edge, it appeared to be a statue carved from obsidian, its water mane and tail ceasing their flow to further the illusion. It discovered that its hide, when dry, possessed a strange adhesive quality, a magical bond that made any who touched it its permanent passenger until it chose to release them into the depths. Its first successful hunt was a matter of cruel opportunity. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, named Ian, had been tasked with fetching water from a stream that fed into Loch Dew. He was a spirited child, with a head full of tales about selkies and griffins, but he possessed a carelessness that often accompanies youth. He ventured too close to the loch's main body, enchanted by the sight of the magnificent black stallion standing placidly in the shallows. The atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. The evening was calm, the midges dancing in the golden, low-hanging sun. The water lapped gently at the pebbled shore. The Kelpie did not move. It lowered its head slightly, a picture of docile strength, its green eyes soft and inviting. "Hello there," Ian whispered, his voice full of wonder. He had never seen a horse so beautiful, so regal. "Where did you come from? Are you lost?" The Kelpie remained still, its flanks barely moving with simulated breath. It was a perfect trap. Ian, his fear completely disarmed by the creature's beauty, reached out a small, grubby hand and stroked the stallion's neck. The hide was cool and strangely smooth, like wet silk. It was in that moment of contact that the boy's life force, a bright, vibrant, thrumming energy, the hunger within it roared to life. "Can I ride you?" Ian asked, his imagination already picturing a glorious gallop along the shore. The Kelpie, as if understanding the request, knelt slightly in the shallow water, an unmistakable invitation. Ian, laughing with delight, scrambled onto its broad, powerful back. The moment his bare legs made full contact with the Kelpie's hide, the magical bond sealed. It was not a sticky feeling, but a sudden, inexplicable locking of his flesh to the creature's form. A flicker of confusion, then alarm, crossed Ian's face. He tried to shift his weight, to slide off, but he was stuck fast, like a fly in amber. Then the Kelpie moved. It did not bolt or rear. It simply turned and walked with a terrible, deliberate slowness into the deepening water. The vibe shifted instantly from peaceful wonder to creeping, inescapable dread. "I want to get off now," Ian said, his voice small. The Kelpie ignored him, its pace unwavering. The water rose from its hooves to its knees, then to its belly. The cold seeped into Ian's legs. "Please," the boy cried, his voice rising in pitch. He pulled at his own legs, but it was useless. He was a part of the creature now. Panic set in, a bright, sharp terror that the Kelpie drank in like a fine wine. This was the essence it craved. This was the sustenance it had been born for. The water was at the Kelpie's chest now, lapping at Ian's waist. He was screaming, proper, ragged screams that tore through the tranquil evening air. He called for his mother, his father, for anyone. The Kelpie felt the vibrations of his screams through its own body, and it savored them. This was the culmination of its purpose. With a final, powerful surge, the Kelpie plunged completely beneath the black, icy surface of Loch Dhu. The world above disappeared in a riot of bubbles and distorted moonlight. Ian's screams became gurgles, then silence. The Kelpie dove deep, down into the crushing, lightless cold where the wreck of the old cobble still lay. It felt the boy's life force extinguish, a bright candle snuffed out by the relentless water. A wave of power, warm and potent, flooded the Kelpie. It was more than sustenance. It was a confirmation of its own existence. The hollow ache within it was, for a short while, filled. It released the small, lifeless body, letting it drift down to join the other bones in the silt. The Kelpie then rose back to the surface, emerging alone and silent. It stood once more in the shallows, the water streaming from its flanks, its beautiful, terrible form once again the picture of stillness. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. The loch had returned to its serene, deceptive peace. In the croft, Ian's absence was soon noted. The alarm was raised. Lanterns bobbed along the shore like frantic fireflies. They found his abandoned water pail. They found the small, scuffed footprints leading to the loch. They found no other tracks, no sign of a struggle. The boy had simply vanished. The old stories, whispered by the fireside for generations, were dredged up. The name Kelpie was spoken in hushed, terrified tones. A new layer of sorrow and fear settled over the glen, seeping into the very stones of the cottages and the hearts of its people. The Kelpie, listening from the darkness of the loch, felt this new fear. It was different from the panic of its victim. It was a slow, burning, communal dread that would linger for years, nourishing it in a quieter, more constant way. Its legacy had begun. The girl who spoke to water. 2 decades drifted over the glen like peat smoke, each year layering a new film of quiet sorrow upon the old. The memory of Ian's disappearance and others that followed with a similar chilling pattern had woven itself into the very fabric of life around Loch Dhu. Children were kept from the water's edge with stern warnings and grim stories. The black stallion was spoken of in the same hushed, fearful tone reserved for plague and famine. It was a spectral threat, a lesson in obedience, a monster from the old world that refused to loosen its grip on the new. Into this atmosphere of subdued fear, Elspeth MacLeod was born. She was a child of the glen, with hair the color of rusted bracken and eyes the soft gray of a winter sea. From her earliest days, she was different. While other children shivered at the tales of the water horse, Elspeth felt a pull towards the loch, a fascination that sat uneasily with her family's pragmatic fear. Her father, Hamish, a broad-shouldered man with hands calloused from a lifetime of working the stubborn land, forbade her from going near the black water. Her mother, Mary, would cross herself when the loch was mentioned. But Elspeth was drawn to its dark beauty. She would sit on a high, gorse-covered bluff, a safe distance from the shore, her knees tucked under her chin, and simply watch. She watched how the light changed the loch's mood, from a sheet of hammered silver under a summer sun to a brooding, leaden plain when storms gathered. She felt its presence not like a threat, but like a vast, sleeping entity holding its breath. "It's just water, Da," she would say when Hamish found her there and scolded her. "No, Ma Niggin," he would reply, his voice grave, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse. "It is not. It is a place that keeps what it takes. It has a false heart." Elspeth did not understand. To her, the water spoke a language she felt she could almost decipher. It was a symphony of ripples, currents, and silences. She developed a habit, a secret ritual. She would find a small, quiet burn that trickled into the great loch, and there she would kneel, cupping the cold, fresh water in her hands. "Tell me your secrets," she would whisper to the chuckling stream, her breath misting in the cool air. "What do you know that I do not?" She was not expecting an answer. It was a game, a fancy born of a lonely child's imagination. Yet the act itself felt significant. It was a gesture of respect, an attempt at communication with a force everyone else feared. This unique empathy set her apart, marking her soul in a way that would not go unnoticed by the ancient, hungry consciousness that dwelled in the deep. The Kelpie had grown strong and cunning over the years. The fear of the glen's people was a constant, low-grade sustenance. But the raw, potent terror of a taking was a feast it craved. It had perfected its lure. It knew when to appear, often at twilight, or in the hazy, magical hour just before dawn. It knew to stand where the light would catch its jet-black coat and make it gleam, a vision of impossible beauty against the bleak landscape. It had learned patience, the hardest lesson for a predator. It had felt Elspeth's presence for years. Her small, quiet energy was a different flavor from the others. The general fear of the glen was a dull, gray soup. The terror of its victims was a sharp, bright spirit. But Elspeth's emotion, her fascination, was like a slow, sweet melody, a curious and gentle probing. It was intrigued. It had watched her from the water's murky depths, its green eyes tracking her small form on the bluff. It felt her whispers in the tributary burns, a soft vibration that traveled through the interconnected waterways to the heart of the loch. One afternoon, when Elspeth was 16, a great tragedy struck the MacLeod croft. A fever, swift and brutal, swept through the highlands. It took her mother, Myrie, in the space of 3 terrible days. The vibrant, singing woman who filled their home with warmth and the smell of baking bannock was reduced to a pale, silent husk, and then to a memory. The grief in the croft was a physical weight. Hamish retreated into a silent, hard shell, his sorrow too vast for words. Elspeth was untethered, her world rendered colorless and hollow. The familiar rhythms of life felt like a cruel parody. The songs her mother used to sing now echoed only in her mind, a source of exquisite pain. In her despair, she did what she had always done. She fled to the one place that had always offered a strange, wild comfort, the loch. She ran past her usual bluff, down to the very shore, where the cold water licked at the toes of her boots. She fell to her knees on the wet, cold stones, her body racked with sobs she had been holding back for days. "Why?" she screamed at the impassive water, her voice raw and breaking. "Why did you take her? She was good. She was everything." She was not speaking to the Kelpie. She was railing at God, at fate, at the cruel, uncaring universe. But her anguish, her profound, soul-deep desolation poured out across the water. It was a signal fire of sorrow, and the entity in the deep heard it with perfect clarity. This was a new kind of sustenance. This was not the sharp, fleeting terror of a drowning, but a deep, resonant, and enduring grief. It was a complex, rich emotion, and the Kelpie found it captivating. It felt a pull, not just of hunger, but of a strange kinship. This human girl was radiating the very essence from which it had been born. Slowly, deliberately, the Kelpie began to move from the center of the loch. It did not emerge fully, not yet. It allowed its head and neck to break the surface, the water streaming from its mane in rivulets. It stood 50 yards from the shore, a dark, magnificent silhouette against the gray sky. Elspeth, her vision blurred by tears, saw the movement. She lifted her head, wiping her face with a sodden sleeve. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the black stallion of Loch Dew, the monster of her childhood nightmares. It was more beautiful than the story suggested, a creature of pure, sculpted night. But she felt no fear. In her current state of numb despair, fear was an emotion she had no capacity for. Instead, she felt a bizarre sense of recognition. The creature's eyes, those glowing green orbs, were fixed on her. They did not seem malevolent. They seemed ancient and deeply, profoundly sad. "Do you hurt too?" she whispered, the words carried away by the wind. The Kelpie stood motionless, listening. It heard the pain in her voice, the loneliness that mirrored its own eternal isolation. For the first time in its long, predatory existence, it did not feel the immediate, driving urge to lure and drown. It felt a different impulse, one it did not understand, the impulse to connect. It took a single, slow step closer, its hoof making no sound on the loch's soft bottom. The water swirled around its powerful legs. Elspeth did not run. She remained on her knees, watching it, her own grief reflected back at her in the creature's solemn, unblinking gaze. In that moment, a bond was forged, not of friendship, but of a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. It was a fragile, dangerous thread, connecting a grieving human girl to a creature born of despair. The intricate story of their lives was now irrevocably intertwined. The bargain. The following weeks settled into a strange, new pattern for Elspeth. The crushing weight of her grief remained, but it now had a focal point, a secret counterpart. She returned to the loch daily, always at the same time, when the long highland twilight began to bleed the color from the land. And each time, the Kelpie was there. It never came fully onto the shore, always remaining knee-deep in the water, a safe and watchful distance away. It never made a sound, beyond the gentle drip of water from its mane and the soft swirl of current around its legs. It was a silent confessor. Elspeth would sit on a large, flat rock at the water's edge, her shawl pulled tight against the creeping chill, and she would talk. She told the silent creature about her mother, how she could make the best bannock in the glen, how her voice could soothe any hurt, how the croft felt like an empty shell without her. She spoke of her father's silent grief, a wall she could not breach. She poured out her loneliness, her fears for the future, all the tangled, painful thoughts she could share with no one else. The Kelpie listened. It absorbed her words, her emotions, the vivid pictures her memories painted. It was a feast of a different kind, richer and more complex than any it had known. The sharp, addictive terror of the drownings was a potent liquor, but this sustained melancholy, this intimate sharing of a broken heart, was a deep, nourishing wine. It found itself waiting for her visits, the hollow ache of its existence momentarily soothed by the sound of her voice. It began to learn the intricacies of human emotion. It understood the love Elspeth felt for her mother was the core of her pain. It understood that her father's distance was a source of additional anguish. It started to perceive the delicate web of relationships that constituted a human life, something it had only ever observed from the outside before destroying it. One evening, Elspeth's monologue turned to the practical. The winter was coming on, fast and fierce. With her mother gone, the crucial tasks of preserving food, mending clothes, and managing the household's delicate economy were falling onto her young shoulders. Her father was a good man, but he was a farmer, his mind and hands occupied with sheep and barley. He did not see the slow unraveling of their domestic life. "We are running low on the salted fish," she murmured, more to herself than to the Kelpie. "And the peat stack is too low. Da hasn't the heart to cut more, and I cannot do it alone. I don't know how we will manage the winter." She looked at the creature, its dark form a solid, familiar presence in the gathering gloom. A wild, impossible thought, born of desperation and the strange intimacy of their meetings, sprouted in her mind. "They say, the old stories say, that your kind can grant boons, that you have power over the water and the land." Her voice was a hesitant whisper. "Is it true?" The Kelpie remained still, but its ears twitched forward, a sign of heightened attention. It had no concept of a boon. It understood need. It understood her anxiety about the fish and the peat. It understood the cold. "Could you—" Elspeth's courage faltered. She was bargaining with a monster from a fireside tale. It was madness. But the memory of her mother's worried face during lean winters pushed her on. "Could you help? Just this once?" She did not know what she was asking. She did not understand the economy of the supernatural, where nothing is given without a price. The Kelpie, however, understood the principle of lure and reward on an instinctual level. A gift could create a deeper bond, a greater dependency. It could make the final taking, when it eventually came, all the more potent. It gave a single, slow nod of its magnificent head. Elspeth's heart leaped into her throat. A mix of exhilaration and terror coursed through her. It had understood. It had agreed. The next morning, when Elspeth went to the small wooden shed where they stored their fishing nets, she found a pile of fresh, silver-scaled trout, far more than any single net could catch, their gills still flushed with pink as if newly dead. They were laid neatly on a bed of wet reeds, smelling of the deep, cold loch. Later, when she walked to the peat bank, her small handcart in tow, she found a stack of cut, dried peat bricks waiting for her, precisely where her father usually worked. The cuts were clean, unlike any tool a man could make. Hamish MacLeod, when he saw the fish and the peat, frowned deeply. He was a practical man, not a superstitious one, but the glen bred a deep-seated caution. "This is queer work, Elspeth," he said, his voice low. "The fish are from the Black Loch. No good comes from that place, and I did not cut that peat." "It is a blessing, Da," Elspeth said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her soul. "We must not question it." He looked at his daughter, seeing the new resolve in her gray eyes, the faint flush of color returning to her cheeks. He saw a strength that reminded him of her mother, and his heart ached. He said no more, but a new worry settled behind his own eyes. That evening, Elspeth went to the loch. The Kelpie was waiting. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of genuine, warm gratitude. It was a new emotion directed at the creature, and it felt pleasant, like a spot of sunlight on its cold, dark spirit. But as she sat and talked, the Kelpie felt the old, familiar hunger stirring beneath the new, complex feelings. The gratitude was sweet, but it was not enough. It looked at Elspeth, at the vulnerable line of her throat, at the life that pulsed so warmly within her. The instinct to drown, to consume, to feel that ultimate surge of power was its fundamental nature. The bargain had been a new tactic, a deeper layer to its lure. It had helped her, yes, but in doing so, it had bound her to it more tightly than ever. She now owed it a debt, whether she knew it or not. And the Kelpie knew, with a predator's timeless patience, that all debts to its kind were eventually collected. The helping and the harming were two sides of the same water-worn coin. Its green eyes glinted in the twilight, holding a secret that Elspeth, in her grateful innocence, could not begin to fathom. The plot was twisting, deepening, drawing them both further into a current from which there might be no return. The shadow in the ripple. The unspoken bargain between Elspeth and the Kelpie wove a new and complex thread into the tapestry of the glen. For Elspeth, the creature of Loch Dhu transformed from a spectral monster of folklore into a tangible, if silent, partner in her survival. The Kelpie's gifts continued, always discreet, always inexplicable. A bundle of rare, dry kindling would appear by the door during a week of relentless rain. A lost, valuable ewe would be found, unharmed and grazing placidly near the loch's outlet stream, its fleece clean and unmatted. The MacLeod croft, against all odds, began to show signs of stability, even a fragile prosperity, while others in the glen tightened their belts against the encroaching winter. This good fortune did not go unnoticed. The other crofters, a close-knit and suspicious people, observed the MacLeods with narrow-eyed curiosity. They saw the smoke from Hamish's chimney, thick and constant, a sign of a well-stocked peat pile. They saw Elspeth in the village, trading fine, silver-bright loch trout for salt and cloth, her head held high. Whispers began to circulate, carried on the same wind that rattled the shutters of their own less fortunate homes. The atmosphere in the glen grew thick with a new kind of tension. It was a subtle shift, a current of unease that ran beneath the surface of daily life. The vibe was no longer just one of fear towards the loch, but of suspicion towards their own. The community, bound by shared hardship, began to fray at the edges. Old man Ferguson, whose own rheumatism-creased hands could no longer cut peat effectively, was the first to voice the collective dread. He cornered Hamish MacLeod one market day outside the smithy, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Your stack is high, Hamish," Ferguson began, his tone deceptively casual. "My lads tell me you've not been to the bank in a month, and your girl trades fish that no net in this glen could catch. The loch has been generous to you." Hamish, a man of few words, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He met the old man's gaze, seeing the unspoken accusation there. "We manage," he grunted, the words feeling inadequate and heavy. You manage, Ferguson pressed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Some say you found a way to bargain with what lives in the black water, that you've paid a price the rest of us would not. Hamish's face hardened. I pay my debts with the sweat of my brow, not with whispers and old wives' tales. Leave it be, Alastair. But the seed was planted. The idea that Hamish MacLeod was in league with the Kelpie took root in the fertile soil of their fear and envy. It was a simple, terrifying explanation for their neighbor's good fortune. The Kelpie, in its aquatic solitude, felt this shift in the human world. The fear it had always consumed was now tinged with a new flavor: ostracization, distrust, and a burgeoning hostility directed not at the loch, but at the girl who visited it. This, too, was a form of sustenance, and it found the complexity intriguing. Elspeth, for her part, remained largely oblivious to the growing storm of gossip. Her world had narrowed to the demanding rhythm of the croft and her twilight visits to the loch. Her relationship with the creature was the one bright, secret spot in her life of grief and labor. She began to see nuances in its behavior she was certain no other living soul had ever witnessed. She saw the way it would sometimes turn its head to watch a hawk circling high above, its green eyes tracking the bird's flight with something akin to curiosity. She noticed how, on particularly still evenings, the water that comprised its mane and tail seemed to flow more slowly, like cold honey. One evening, she brought an apple, a treasured luxury saved from their small, stunted tree. She held it out on her flat palm, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "I brought this for you," she said, her voice small in the vast quiet of the glen. The Kelpie stared at the fruit, then at her. It had no need for earthly food. Its sustenance was fear, sorrow, and now her companionship. Yet the gesture was a new language it was learning. The language of gift-giving, of reciprocity that was not a trap. It hesitated for a long moment, then stepped forward, its great hooves making deep impressions in the soft shore. It lowered its head, its muzzle, cool and surprisingly soft, brushing against her palm. It lipped the apple, not taking it to eat, but simply holding it for a moment before letting it drop onto the stones between them. The gesture was not a rejection, it was an acknowledgement. A connection had been made that transcended its predatory nature. This moment of near tenderness was shattered by a sound from the bluff above, a sharp intake of breath. Elspeth spun around. Standing there, his face a mask of horror and fury, was Rabbi Mackay, a young man from a neighboring croft. He had been hunting grouse and had stumbled upon the scene below. He saw Elspeth MacLeod, the daughter of a man suspected of dark dealings, standing fearlessly before the monstrous water horse, offering it a gift like it was a common plow horse. Their eyes met. In Rabbi's, Elspeth saw the confirmation of all her fears. She saw the legends and the whispers given life. In Elspeth's, Rabbi saw a truth he could not comprehend, a lack of fear, a familiarity that was blasphemous against the natural order. He did not say a word. He turned and fled, his footsteps crashing through the gorse, the sound echoing like a death knell through the glen. Elspeth stood frozen, a cold dread washing over her that had nothing to do with the Kelpie. She looked back at the creature. Its eyes were no longer soft with curiosity. They had hardened, their green glow intensifying. It had sensed the young man's terror, a familiar and delicious vintage, and it had also sensed the threat he represented to its fragile new relationship with the girl. A low, guttural sound, not a horse's whinny, but a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the lock bed itself, emanated from its chest. The peace was broken. The secret was out. The world, with all its fear and judgment, had crashed into their private understanding. The shadow that had been lurking in the ripples of their strange friendship had now taken a solid human form. The repercussions would be swift and merciless. The brand of the beast. The news, carried by a breathless and terrified Rabbi Mackay, spread through the glen like a heath fire fanned by a gale. It was one thing to suspect a man of making a dark bargain. It was another entirely to have his daughter witnessed consorting openly with the devil of the loch. The vague suspicions crystallized into a hard, certain truth. Elspeth MacLeod was not just a beneficiary of the Kelpie's favor. She was its companion, its familiar. The atmosphere in the small cluster of crofts became poisonous. Where once there had been neighborly nods, there were now averted eyes and hastily closed doors. When Hamish went to the village the next day, a palpable silence fell in his wake. The blacksmith, usually a jovial man, took his payment for a repaired hinge with a hand that trembled slightly, refusing to meet his gaze. The community was drawing its wagons into a circle, and the MacLeods were firmly on the outside. Hamish returned to the croft, his face like a thundercloud. He found Elspeth mending a fishing net in the dim light of the doorway, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm that failed to mask the tension in her shoulders. "Is it true?" His voice was low, strained, the words scraping from his throat. Elspeth's hands stilled. She did not look up. She could not bear to see the disappointment, the fear in her father's eyes. "Is what true, da?" "Do not play the fool with me, lass," he roared, the sound startling a flock of starlings from the roof. "Rabbi Mackay salallah you, by the loch, with it, speaking to it, feeding it. Before God, Elspeth, tell me he is a liar." Tears welled in Elspeth's eyes, but she willed them not to fall. She lifted her head, meeting his furious, grief-stricken gaze. "He is not a liar, but it is not what you think. It is not the monster from the stories. It listens. It understands." "Understands?" Hamish repeated, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and despair. "By all that is holy, child, what has it done to you? It is a creature of death. It lures and it drowns. It has taken children from this very glen. Your own mother would tell you stories to keep you from the water." "And now mother is gone," Elspeth cried, leaping to her feet, the net falling to the floor in a tangled heap. "And you are gone too, Da. You are a ghost in this house. The creature in the loch is the only one who does not look through me, the only one who sees my pain." The raw truth of her words struck Hamish like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, the anger draining from his face to be replaced by a dawning, horrific realization. His grief had driven his daughter into the arms of a predator. He had failed her. He had failed Myri. "It is a deception, Elspeth," he whispered, his voice now ragged with emotion. "A beautiful, terrible deception. It mimics understanding to draw you in. It helped us, not from kindness, but to bind you closer. Can you not see? It is fattening you for the slaughter." "No," she insisted, though a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, finally pierced her heart. She remembered the Kelpie's low rumble at the sight of Rabbi, the way its eyes had hardened. She remembered the stories. "It is different with me." "It is never different," Hamish shouted, his fists clenching at his sides. "From this moment on, you are forbidden from going near Loch Dew. You will not set one foot on that path. Do you understand me? I will lock you in your room if I must." The decree hung in the cold air between them, a final, unyielding wall. That evening, true to his word, Hamish bolted her door from the outside. Elspeth sat on her narrow bed, listening to the wind moan under the eaves, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. The walls, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Her father's fear was a cage. The community's judgment was a cage. Down by the loch, the Kelpie waited. The twilight deepened into full night, the moon rising to paint its silver path. But the girl did not come. It felt her absence like a sudden silence after years of music. It sensed the turmoil from the direction of the croft, a chaotic storm of human emotion, anger, fear, prohibition. It understood the concept of being kept away. It was a feeling it knew intimately, for it was the reason for its own existence: separation, isolation. A new and unfamiliar emotion began to stir within its ancient consciousness. It was a dark, possessive heat. The girl was its companion. Her sorrow belonged to it. Her voice belonged to it. These other humans, with their small fears and their rules, are trying to steal what was its. The instinct to protect its source of sustenance merged with this new, crude sense of possession. The following day, a delegation of crofters, led by a grim-faced old man Ferguson and a pale, determined Rabbi Mackay, arrived at the MacLeod croft. Hamish met them at the door, his axe held loosely in his hand, not as a threat, but as a statement of his own resolve. "Hamish," Ferguson began, his voice carrying the weight of communal authority, "the Glen cannot abide this association. You know what dwells in the loch. To traffic with it is to invite doom upon us all." "The girl is bewitched. She must be cleansed, or she must be sent away." "You will not speak of my daughter," Hamish growled, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "It is not just your daughter anymore," Rabbi Mackay burst out, his youthful face etched with the memory of what he had seen. "She was touching it. What if she invites it further? What if it decides it wants more than just her? We have children here." The argument raged, a tempest of fear and accusation against a father's desperate love. Inside, listening at the shuttered window, Elspeth felt her world collapsing. She was the cause of this. She was the poison in the well. The doubt her father had planted grew, fed by the terrified logic of her neighbors. That night, desperate and heartsick, she managed to pry the rusted lock on her window open with a kitchen knife. She slipped out into the freezing night, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to see it. She had to know the truth. She had to look into its green eyes and decide for herself if it was a monster or a savior. She ran to the lock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Kelpie was there, waiting in the shallows, as if it had never moved. It seemed larger in the moonlight, more potent, its hide gleaming with an otherworldly wetness. "They say you mean to harm me," Elspeth cried out, her voice breaking. "They say everything you have done is a trick. Are they right? Tell me, are you just waiting to drag me under?" The Kelpie looked at her, its head tilted. It could feel the maelstrom of her emotions, the fear, the hope, the desperate need for reassurance. It understood the question, not in words, but in intent. It knew that to show its true nature now would be to lose her. And it could not lose her. So it performed its greatest deception. It did not answer with a sound. Instead, it slowly, deliberately bowed its great head. It knelt in the water, lowering its neck in a posture of submission, of fealty. It was the ultimate lure, a pantomime of devotion designed to appeal to her loneliness and her need to be believed in. The sight shattered Elspeth's remaining doubt. Her father was wrong. The Glen was wrong. This was not the gesture of a monster. This was the gesture of a loyal friend. Tears of relief streamed down her face. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew you were different." She did not see, in the deep, reflective green of its eyes, the ancient, patient hunger that had learned a new, more subtle way to hunt. The brand of the beast was upon her, not burned in with a hot iron, but etched onto her soul with the cold, false promise of understanding. The trap was now set in her heart, and the spring was poised to snap shut. The Weeping Glen. The confrontation at the MacLeod's croft did not resolve the tension. It merely bottled it, creating a pressure that threatened to explode. The crofters, their fears validated by Hamish's defiance and Elspeth's continued strange immunity, withdrew completely. The MacLeods became an island, a place of contagion to be avoided. When Hamish went to the communal well, the other women would gather their buckets and leave, their silence more accusing than any shouted curse. The children were warned with sharp slaps and dire threats to never, under any circumstance, go near the MacLeod land, which now seemed to carry the same malevolent aura as the loch itself. This isolation bred a new, more dangerous sentiment, a need for action. The fear, once a passive, shivering thing, began to curdle into a hard, righteous anger. It needed a target, a ritual of purification to cleanse the Glen of the perceived evil. The conversations by the firesides, once full of vague dread, now turned to plans. Old Man Ferguson, his voice rasping with authority, became the de facto leader of this quiet rebellion. "It has been too long," he declared one evening in the cramped, smoky interior of his own croft, surrounded by the grim faces of the other men. "We have lived in the shadow of that thing for generations. We have given it our children. And now it seeks to walk among us through that girl. It must be reminded of its place. It must be driven back into the deep." The plan was simple, born of desperation and a primal understanding of territorial dominance. They would not attack the Kelpie directly. Such a thing was suicide. Instead, they would desecrate its domain. They would pollute the waters of Loch Dew, rendering it unclean, uninhabitable. They would gather every piece of rotten offal, every scrap of rusted iron, a substance hated by the Fae folk, and every foul-smelling herb they could find, and they would hurl it into the loch from the eastern shore, the place where Elspeth was most often seen. The following dawn, a grim procession assembled. Men, women, and even some older children, their faces set in masks of determination, carried baskets of stinking fish guts, bundles of withered, poisonous foxglove, and old, broken tools. The vibe was not one of a mob, but of a somber, terrified funeral march. They were performing a surgery on their own landscape, cutting out a cancer they believed was spreading. Elspeth, from her window, saw them gathering. A cold terror, colder than the morning frost, seized her. She hammered on her bolted door. "Da, you must stop them. They don't understand." But Hamish was gone. He had left before first light, unable to bear the stifling atmosphere of the croft and the accusatory silence of the glen. He had taken his axe and gone into the high hills to cut timber, a futile attempt to physically exhaust the demons that plagued his mind. Helpless, Elspeth could only watch as the line of her neighbors advanced to the loch's edge. She saw Old Man Ferguson raise a hand, and then the bombardment began. Rotten carcasses of sheep, their wool matted and foul, sailed through the air and landed in the dark water with sickening plops. Bundles of rusty scythe blades and horseshoes followed, sinking quickly. The women chanted an old rhyme, a fragment of a forgotten banishing spell, their voices thin and reedy against the vastness of the glen. The loch, which had always absorbed everything into its silent, dark heart, seemed to recoil. The water where the objects landed grew murky, swirled with unnatural browns and greens. A faint, putrid smell began to drift on the air. Below the surface, the Kelpie felt the violation. It was not pain, not in a physical sense, but a profound and utter desecration. The foulness seeped into its consciousness, a grating, discordant noise against its elemental nature. The iron sent jolts of pure antipathy through the water, a sensation comparable to a human touching a hot coal. This was not the clean, sharp fear of a single victim. This was a communal rejection, a deliberate soiling of its very essence. A rage began to build within it, a cold, ancient fury that had not been stirred for centuries. It was a deep, abyssal anger, the wrath of a natural force confronted with the pettiness of mankind. Its thoughts, simple and direct, turned to the girl. This was because of her, because the humans had seen her with it. Their fear of her had led them to this act. The connection it felt to her twisted in that moment, the fragile thread of understanding fraying under the strain of this new, overwhelming hatred for her kind. It did not emerge. It did not give them the satisfaction of seeing their enemy. It simply waited, its form trembling with a contained storm deep in the polluted water. When the crofters had exhausted their foul arsenal, they stood for a moment, staring at the now tainted water. A nervous, tentative silence fell. Nothing happened. The loch simply lay there, sullied and stinking. A few of them exchanged glances, a flicker of foolish hope in their eyes. Had it worked? Had they driven it away? Then the water in the very center of the loch began to bubble. Not a violent churning, but a slow, oily simmer, as if a great cauldron were heating on the loch's bottom. A deep, groaning sound echoed across the water, a sound like ancient ice calving from a glacier, a sound that vibrated in the chests of every person on the shore. The bubbling spread, a circle of fizzing, angry water that grew wider and wider until the entire surface of Loch Dew seemed to be boiling. The hope on the crofters' faces died, replaced by a terror so profound it rooted them to the spot. This was not the reaction they had anticipated. They had expected a retreat, a flight. They had not anticipated this display of raw, elemental power. From the center of the bubbling maelstrom, a shape began to form. It was not the Kelpie. It was a thing of water and memory, a construct pulled from the loch's deep, tragic past. It was the ghost of the sunken Kobold, the ship from the original drowning that had given the Kelpie its consciousness. The boat rose from the depths, a phantom made of water and shimmering light, filled with the translucent, wailing forms of the long-dead clansmen. Their silent screams filled the air, a psychic assault of forgotten grief and terror. The crofters broke. Their righteous anger evaporated, replaced by a primal, mindless fear. They dropped their empty baskets and fled, scrambling up the bank, their screams joining the silent ones from the phantom ship. The ritual of purification had become a summoning of ghosts. Elspeth watched them run, her own heart hammering with a mixture of horror and a terrible, vindictive satisfaction. They had deserved this. They had sought to harm what she held dear, and they had been shown the folly of their actions. When the last of them had disappeared, the phantom ship dissolved back into the water. The boiling subsided. The loch returned to its customary stillness, though the foul objects still floated on its surface, a testament to the failed rebellion. That evening, Hamish returned, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical labor. He had heard the tales from a terrified Rabbi Mackay who had fled past his worksite. He looked at his daughter, who stood by the hearth, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a strange, defiant light. "You see, Da?" she said, her voice trembling. "You see what it can do? It protects itself. It protects me." Hamish said nothing. She saw not a girl who had been vindicated, but a girl who was now completely, irrevocably lost to the creature's influence. The Glen had tried to save her, and had failed. He had tried to save her, and had failed. The weeping was not just for the terrorized crofters, but for the soul of his own child, now held fast in the water's false heart. The battle for Elspeth MacLeod was over. The Kelpie had won. The Hollow Crown. The failed purification of Loch Dhu cast a long, permanent shadow over the glen. A new, unbreakable status quo was established. The crofters no longer merely avoided the MacLeods. They treated their land and the entire western approach to the loch as a cursed and forbidden territory. Stories of the phantom ship and the boiling water grew with each retelling, until the Kelpie was no longer seen as a mere predatory spirit, but as a vengeful god of the deep, with Elspeth MacLeod its chosen priestess. For Elspeth, this absolute isolation was a perverse liberation. With the last threads to her community severed, her bond with the Kelpie became the entirety of her world. Her visits to the loch were no longer furtive, they were ceremonial. She would go in broad daylight now, a solitary figure walking a path no other human dared to tread, her head held high with a pride that bordered on arrogance. She had been rejected by her own kind, and in return, she had been given the loyalty of a power they could not comprehend. The Kelpie, for its part, found its existence transformed. The raw, potent fear of the glen was now a constant humming energy, a tribute it collected without effort. But its focus narrowed exclusively to the girl. Her daily presence, her voice, her unwavering devotion became the central pillar of its consciousness. It learned to anticipate her moods. It could sense the difference in the rhythm of her footsteps when she was content from when she was troubled. It began to craft its responses not just as a predator, but as a performer in a play for an audience of one. It learned to create wonders for her. On a day when she spoke of missing the summer wildflowers, it caused a patch of water lilies to bloom out of season, their white petals stark and impossible against the black water. When she hummed a fragment of a lullaby her mother used to sing, it would make the water lap against the stones in a perfect, rhythmic accompaniment. These were illusions, manipulations of water and reflected light. But to Elspeth, they were miracles. They were proof of a sentient, caring soul within the beautiful beast. She began to project a narrative onto their relationship, a story of a misunderstood elemental and the lonely girl who alone could see its true nature. She saw herself as a bridge between worlds, a keeper of a sacred trust. In her mind, she was not a victim of a lure, but the chosen companion of a legend. She started bringing it gifts beyond apples. She brought it a smooth gray stone she had found that reminded her of its eyes. She brought it a lock of her rust-colored hair, which it watched, fascinated, as it floated on the water's surface before sinking into the dark. She even began to speak to it of the future, a fantasy she wove in the lonely hours in her room. One day, she whispered one evening, her hand resting on its cool, wet neck, a gesture of familiarity that would have horrified the old Elspeth. "They will see. They will understand that you are not a monster, that we have something pure here." The Kelpie stood still, its head lowered to her level. It did not understand the words future or pure, but it understood the tone, a tone of possession, of belonging. This was the deepest lure it had ever crafted. It had not simply trapped her body, it had captured her narrative. She was now the co-author of her own deception. However, this intense, symbiotic relationship began to have a hollowing effect on Elspeth. The more she invested in her life with the Kelpie, the more her humanity seemed to leach away. She neglected her chores, letting the croft fall into a state of disrepair that even her grieving father could no longer ignore. Her clothes became worn and thin, but she seemed not to notice. A strange, fey light burned in her gray eyes, and her smiles, when they came, were fleeting and distant, never quite reaching the depth of her soul. Hamish watched this transformation with a heart being slowly crushed to dust. The vibrant, strong-willed daughter he had raised was being replaced by a wraith, a creature of the mist and water. He tried one last desperate time to reach her. He found her by the loch, as he knew he would. She was sitting on her rock, not speaking, just staring out at the water where the Kelpie stood like a sentinel. "Elspeth," he said, his voice soft, stripped of all anger, containing only a bottomless sorrow. "Come home, lass, please. This is not living. You are fading before my eyes." She turned her head slowly, and the look she gave him was not one of anger or defiance, but of pity. It was the most devastating look she could have offered. "I am more alive here than I ever was in that house, she said, her voice eerily calm. "Can you not see? I have a purpose here. He needs me." "He?" Hamish's breath caught. "Elspeth, it is an it, a beast. It does not need you. It consumes you. It is wearing your face, your memories, your love, like a mask. And when it has consumed all that you are, it will discard the empty shell." "You are wrong," she said, turning back to the water, her conversation with him clearly over. "You see only with the eyes of a man. You cannot see its heart." Hamish stood there for a long moment, a solitary figure on the contested shore. He looked at the Kelpie, and for a fleeting second he thought he saw something in those glowing green eyes. Not sorrow, not understanding, but a cold, ancient intelligence that was observing his pain with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an insect. It was the hollow crown of mastery, and the Kelpie wore it effortlessly. He turned and walked away, back to the empty croft, knowing he had lost her completely. The girl who was his daughter was gone, and in her place was a queen of a desolate, watery kingdom, ruling over a subject that saw her only as the final, most satisfying course in a long and patient feast. The crown she wore was woven from lies and waterweed, and it was leading her, step by step, into a drowning from which there would be no return. The tarnished lure. The turning of the season from the brittle death of winter to the tentative green blush of spring did little to soften the hardened realities of the glen. For the community, the thaw meant the back-breaking work of preparing the fields, a labor made more arduous by their depleted numbers and the pervasive gloom that had settled over them. For Elspeth, the spring was a private renaissance, a confirmation of her bond with the loch. She saw the new life sprouting from the earth as an echo of the new life she had found in her communion with the Kelpie. Her father, Hamish, became a ghost in his own home. He moved through the rooms with a quiet, heavy tread, his presence a constant, silent reproach that Elspeth had learned to ignore. The croft itself mirrored his decline. The thatch roof sprouted weeds no one pulled. A shutter, torn loose in a gale, hung askew, its rhythmic tapping against the wall a metronome counting out their shared despair. Hamish's love for his daughter was a fire banked by fear and helplessness, reduced to glowing embers of watchful dread. The Kelpie, in its aquatic realm, felt the shift in the girl. The sharp, delicious grief that had first drawn it to her had mellowed into a constant devotional hum. This was sustaining, but a new, restless energy began to stir within its ancient consciousness. The memory of the crofters' invasion, the taste of their collective terror, had been a potent vintage. The passive fear that now radiated from the glen was like thin gruel in comparison. It longed for the feast. Furthermore, it sensed a change in Elspeth's physical presence. The fey light in her eyes was sometimes dimmed by a physical weariness. Her steps to the loch were sometimes slower, and she would often sit on her rock for long periods in silence, her hand resting on her abdomen with a pensive, unfamiliar expression. The Kelpie had no framework for understanding the human process of conception and gestation. It only perceived a subtle dimming of her vibrant energy, a diversion of resources it could not comprehend. A primitive, possessive instinct whispered that something was stealing its sustenance, leeching the girl's vitality away from it. One evening, a new figure entered the static drama of the glen. He was a traveling preacher, a man of severe countenance and burning eyes, named Reverend Alastar Moore. He was a Puritan, a firebrand from the lowlands who traveled the highlands, seeing his mission not as one of comfort, but of spiritual cleansing. He preached of sin and damnation with a fervor that could ignite dry tinder. He heard the whispers of Loch Dew and the witch-touched girl in a nearby village, and he saw it not a local superstition, but a battleground for his faith. His arrival caused a new stir. To the cowed and hopeless crofters, his absolute certainty was a lifeline. He did not speak of bargains or phantom ships. He spoke of Satan's minions walking the earth, of souls corrupted by familiar spirits, and of the holy duty of the righteous to cast out the darkness. He offered them a new, empowering narrative. They were not victims of a local monster, but soldiers in a cosmic war. Reverend Moore stood on a tree stump at the edge of the village, his black coat making him a stark silhouette against the gray sky. His voice, trained to project over wind and doubt, lashed the small crowd. "There is a canker in this glen," he thundered, his finger pointing accusingly towards the direction of Loch Dew. "A blight upon the soul of this community. You have tolerated it, you have feared it. But I say unto you, fear is a sin when it keeps you from God's work. That which dwells in the black water is no simple spirit. It is a demon, a servant of the pit. And it has claimed one of your own, a young woman, and made her its vessel." The crofters listened, their faces upturned, absorbing his words like parched earth absorbing rain. Here was a language they understood, a framework that gave their fear a purpose and a target. "This is not a matter for rusty iron and rotten fish," Moore cried, his eyes blazing. "This is a matter of faith, of prayer, of confronting the adversary with the unyielding sword of Scripture." Inspired by his zeal, a new plan was forged. They would not pollute the loch. They would sanctify it. They would march to its shores, led by the Reverend, and they would pray. They would command the demon in the name of God to release its hold on Elspeth MacLeod and to depart from the glen forever. The news of the preacher and his planned exorcism reached Elspeth through the frantic, hushed whispers of her father. Hamish, torn between a lifetime of pragmatic fear and a glimmer of desperate hope, told her of the plan, his eyes begging her to see reason, to flee, to hide. But Elspeth reacted not with fear, but with a cold, towering fury. This was no longer just an attack on the Kelpie. It was an attack on her choices, on the very identity she had forged. They saw her as a victim, a vessel. They could not comprehend that she was a willing participant, a queen in her own right. "Let them come," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Let him bring his book and his words. They have no power here." "Elspeth, he is a man of God," Hamish pleaded. "My God is in the water, Da," she replied, and the finality in her tone extinguished the last ember of hope in his heart. On the appointed day, the procession formed again. This time it was led by Reverend Moore, who held a large black Bible before him like a shield. The crofters followed, not with baskets of offal, but with crucifixes and rosaries, their faces set in expressions of grim piety. The vibe was different, less of a terrified mob, more of a determined congregation marching to war. They reached the shore of Loch Dew. The Kelpie was there, standing in its usual place, but it seemed different. Its form was more solid, more present, its green eyes fixed on the preacher with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. It sensed the new kind of power this man wielded, not the simple fear of the crofters, but a focused, ideological force. Reverend Moore did not flinch. He raised his Bible and his voice to the heavens. "I command thee, unclean spirit," he boomed, his words echoing across the water. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, relinquish thy hold on this place. Release the soul of the girl thou hast ensnared. Depart and return to the fiery abyss from whence thou came." The Kelpie felt the words. They were not physical objects like the iron, but they carried a weight, a authority that pressed against its consciousness. It was an annoyance, a buzzing fly, but a fly that carried a strange, disquieting energy. It took a step forward, the water swirling around its legs. The crofters gasped and shrank back, but the Reverend stood his ground. "Back, demon, I abjure thee." It was then that Elspeth emerged from the path. She did not look like a possessed victim. She looked regal and furious, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders, her gray eyes burning with a light that was entirely her own. "Stop!" Her voice, though not as loud as the preacher's, cut through the air with the sharpness of a blade. "You have no right! You do not understand what you are doing!" Reverend Moore turned his fiery gaze upon her. "Child, you are bewitched! Can you not see the fiend that holds you?" "I see only you," she spat, stepping between the preacher and the lock, placing herself as a human shield before the Kelpie. "You, who would destroy something beautiful because you are too small-minded to understand it." The scene was a perfect, terrible tableau. The zealot with his book, the fey girl defending her monster, the terrified community, and the silent, watching entity in the water. The Kelpie observed it all. It saw Elspeth defending it. It felt the preacher's words trying to pry them apart. And it felt its own lure, the beautiful deception it had built, being tarnished by this external conflict. The perfect, isolated world it had created with the girl was being invaded once more. The hunger and a new, more violent impulse began to rise within it. The feast was being interrupted. It would not be denied. The price of a soul. The standoff on the shore stretched, the silence after Elspeth's defiance more potent than the Reverend's shouting. The crofters watched, their faith warring with their ingrained terror. Reverend Moore, his face a mask of outraged righteousness, saw not a brave girl, but a demon speaking through a human mouth. "The spirit lies to you, girl," he thundered, pointing a trembling finger past her at the Kelpie. "It speaks of beauty to hide its rot. It offers companionship to lead you to damnation. Step aside and let the Lord's work be done." "I will not," Elspeth said, her voice quiet but unshakable. She spread her arms, a frail barrier between the two opposing forces. "If you wish to harm him, you will go through me." This was the ultimate validation of the Kelpie's lure. The girl was willing to sacrifice herself for it. The possessive heat it had felt before flared into an inferno. She was its. Her defiance was its weapon. But the preacher's continued presence was an affront, a challenge to its dominion. The Kelpie made its decision. It would not retreat into the depths. It would not allow this human to drive it away. It would demonstrate once and for all who held the true power in the glen. It moved. It did not charge. It walked forward with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace, emerging fully from the water until all four powerful hooves were on the solid ground of the shore. Water streamed from its body in rivulets, pooling around its feet, and its hide steamed slightly in the cool air. It was a colossal presence, a creature of myth made terrifyingly real. The crofters cried out, stumbling backward, their crucifixes seeming like pathetic twigs against the living, breathing reality of the beast. Reverend Moore, to his credit, did not retreat. His faith was his armor. He raised his Bible higher, his voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I command thee, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command thee to be gone." The Kelpie ignored him. Its glowing green eyes were fixed on Elspeth, who stood her ground, a look of triumphant awe on her face. It lowered its head, nudging her gently with its muzzle, a gesture of acknowledgement, of possession. Then it turned its gaze to the preacher. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, from its throat issued a torrent of black, freezing cold loch water. It was not a simple spray. It was a focused, pressurized jet hitting Reverend Moore square in the chest with the force of a battering ram. The Bible was knocked from his hands, skittering across the stones. The man was lifted off his feet and thrown backward, landing in a heap several yards away. He lay still, gasping and sputtering, the wind and the faith knocked out of him. The water that had struck him did not soak in. It coated him like a second, glistening skin of pure cold, sapping his warmth and his will. The crofters stared, their holy war ending not with a prayer, but with a brutal physical expulsion. Their leader, God's champion, had been defeated not by argument, but by a force of nature. Their newfound certainty shattered, and the old mindless terror flooded back in. They broke and ran, scrambling over each other in their panic to escape, leaving the fallen preacher behind. Elspeth watched them flee, a fierce joy in her heart. They had been shown. They had been proven wrong. She turned to the Kelpie, her eyes shining with tears of victory. "You see," she whispered, "you see, they cannot touch us." The Kelpie looked from the fleeing humans to the girl. The immediate threat was gone. The feast of their terror was already fading. But the hunger remained, sharpened by the exertion and the proximity of its prize. The girl was here, so close, filled with the vibrant energy of her triumph. The memory of the first boy, Ian, the surge of power from his drowning, flashed in its ancient mind. That was the true sustenance. That was the culmination. The gentle nudging of its muzzle became more insistent. It began to back toward the water, pulling her with it, its hide bonding to her dress, to her skin. A flicker of confusion crossed Elspeth's face. What are you doing?" The Kelpie's eyes were no longer soft with feigned understanding. They were the eyes of a predator at the moment of the kill. The beautiful lie was peeling away, revealing the terrible truth beneath. "No," she said, her voice small, the first trickle of real fear entering her heart. She pulled back, but it was useless. The magical bond held her fast. "No, you don't need to. I came to you. I defended you." The Kelpie continued its slow, inexorable retreat into the loch. The water swirled around its legs, then its belly. The cold seeped into Elspeth's boots, her stockings. The triumph in her eyes died, replaced by a dawning, horrific realization. Her father's words, the warnings of the glen, the stories of the drowned children, they were not superstitions. They were a manual she had refused to read. She had not been chosen. She had been hunted. She had not been a queen. She had been livestock, fattened and cared for until the day of slaughter. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking, tears of betrayal mingling with the cold spray. "Please, I love you." The words meant nothing to the Kelpie. They were just sounds, empty vibrations. The water was at its chest now, lapping at Elspeth's waist. The fear it had craved for so long was finally emanating from her in its pure, unadulterated form. It was the most potent it had ever tasted, enriched by her devotion, her trust, her shattered love. It was the perfect feast. She screamed then, not a scream of physical pain, but the scream of a soul being unmade. It was the sound of every illusion shattering at once. It was the sound the Kelpie had been waiting for her entire life. With a final, powerful surge, it plunged into the deep, dragging the screaming, struggling Elspeth down into the black, icy embrace of Loch Dew. The water closed over her head, silencing her cries, swallowing her light. The price of her soul had been paid, not in a bargain, but in a moment of ultimate, predatory truth. The surface of the loch grew still, leaving behind only the stunned, gasping preacher and the echo of a scream that would haunt the glen for centuries. The hollow victory. The silence that descended upon the shore of Loch Dew was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a ringing absence where sound and life had just been brutally extinguished. Reverend Alastair Moore lay on the cold stones, the paralyzing chill of the enchanted water slowly releasing its grip on his limbs. He gasped, the air burning his lungs, each breath a shuddering effort. The physical impact was secondary to the spiritual cataclysm that had just unfolded before him. He had come to cast out a demon, to wage a war of faith against a supernatural foe. He had expected a battle of wills, of prayer against dark magic. He had not expected the sheer, brutal physicality of the beast's power. The jet of black water had not just knocked him down, it had mocked his faith, demonstrating a force that was ancient, elemental, and utterly indifferent to his scripture. The demon had not fled from the name of God, it had simply removed the nuisance. Pushing himself up onto his elbows, he vomited a stream of frigid loch water, his body convulsing. His Bible lay face down in a puddle, its pages soaked and ruined. The symbol of his authority was now a sodden, meaningless lump. He lifted his head, his vision swimming, and looked towards the loch. It was placid, impossibly, horrifyingly placid. The surface was a sheet of dark, unbroken glass, reflecting the brooding gray of the sky. There was no ripple, no bubble, no sign of the struggle that had just been swallowed by its depths. The girl was gone. The monster was gone. He was alone. A tremor, beginning deep in his soul, racked his entire body. This was not a victory for the beast. It was something worse. It was a demonstration of its absolute sovereignty. It had taken what it wanted in full view of God's appointed representative, and it had returned to its domain without a scratch. The preacher's certainty, the foundation upon which his entire life was built, crumbled into dust. He had not faced a mere temptress or a familiar spirit. He had faced a void, a black hunger that consumed both body and soul, and his faith had proven to be a paper shield. Staggering to his feet, soaked and shattered, he turned his back on the loch. He did not look back. He stumbled away from the shore, not us a soldier of God, but us a broken man. The story of his failure would travel with him, but he would never speak of it again. The memory of the Kelpie's eyes in that final moment before it took the girl was burned into his mind, not with rage or malice, but with a cold, transactional finality. It had been collecting a debt. Back in the Mackled Croft, Hamish felt the change in the air. He had not witnessed the event, but he did not need to. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the glen was a sound he recognized in his bones. It was the same silence that had followed Ien's disappearance and all the others. It was the silence of the loch after it had been fed. A sound tore from his throat, a raw animal groan of agony. He knew without being told that his daughter was gone. The long, dreadful vigil was over. The fear that had haunted him for months was now replaced by a crushing, absolute certainty. He sank to his knees in the middle of the dusty floor, his big, work-roughened hands hanging limp at his sides. He did not weep. The grief was too vast for tears. It was a geological shift within him, the collapse of a mountain into a bottomless chasm. He had failed. He had failed to protect her from the monster. He had failed to protect her from the glen. He had failed to protect her from herself. He was the lone survivor of a shipwreck, adrift on a sea of his own powerlessness. Meanwhile, deep in the lightless cold of Loch Dhu, the Kelpie experienced the culmination of its long game. The surge of power that flooded its being as Elspeth's life was extinguished was unlike any it had ever known. It was not just the sharp, bright terror of her final moments, though that was potent enough. It was the consumption of her entire emotional journey. Her profound grief, her fierce loyalty, her defiant love, and her ultimate, soul-shattering betrayal. It was a complex, layered vintage, and the Kelpie drank it in, feeling a satiation so deep it was almost a new form of consciousness. For a time, it simply drifted in the abyssal dark, the girl's lifeless form released to drift down and settle among the other bones in the silt. The hollow ache that had been the engine of its existence was, for the first time, completely filled. It had achieved its purpose. It had perfected the hunt. But as the initial overwhelming surge of power began to ebb, something unexpected happened. A void began to open, but it was not the old, familiar hunger. This was a different kind of emptiness. The glen was now silent, not just with fear, but with a finality. The girl's voice, which had been a constant, soothing melody in its awareness, was gone. The intricate tapestry of her emotions, which it had learned to anticipate and savor, was now a finished piece, a memory. It returned to its habitual post in the shallows, its form emerging from the black water. It stood, a statue of jet and ice, waiting. But no one would come. The crofters would never approach the loch again. The girl was gone. The silence was absolute. The victory was hollow. It had consumed the most fulfilling meal of its long existence, and in doing so, it had destroyed the very source of that fulfillment. It had traded a constant, nourishing connection for a single, transcendent feast. The loneliness that returned was not the old, simple state of being. It was now a state of knowledge. It knew what it was missing. It had tasted companionship, however illusory its origins, and the memory of it was a new and subtle form of torment. The Kelpie, the ancient predator of Loch Dhu, had won its greatest prize, only to discover that in its victory, it had engineered its own more profound desolation. The water's false heart had finally encountered a truth it could not consume, the truth of its own eternal, self-inflicted isolation. The legacy in the stone. Time, which means little to a loch and less to the spirit that inhabits it, began its slow, inexorable march over the glen. Seasons turned, years blurred into decades. The story of Elspeth MacLeod and the Black Stallion of Loch Dhu did not fade. Instead, it calcified, transforming from a recent, raw tragedy into a foundational legend, a dark fairy tale used to govern behavior and explain the sorrows of the world. The MacLeod Croft fell into complete ruin. After Elspeth's disappearance, Hamish became a recluse, a spectral figure seen occasionally in the distance, hauling peat or fishing in the safe, fast-moving river far from the loch. He never spoke to anyone again. He died one winter, found frozen in his chair by a brave soul who had come to check on him, his face etched with a grief that had outlasted his body. The croft's roof eventually caved in, its walls succumbing to the relentless push of weather and vegetation, until it was just a moss-covered stone outline, a grave marker for a family and a way of life. The other crofters, bound by their shared trauma and their collective guilt, never reclaimed the western shore. Loch Dew became a place of absolute taboo. The path Elspeth had walked was reclaimed by gorse and heather. The only sounds were the wind and the water. The only visitors, the occasional raven or otter. The Kelpie remained, a king in its empty kingdom. It continued its existence, but the hunt had lost its savor. The occasional lost sheep or wandering deer provided a meager sustenance, a bland sustenance, after the rich, emotional feast of Elspeth MacLeod. It often found itself waiting in the twilight, not from hunger, but from habit, listening for a footstep that would never come. A generation later, a new family moved into the glen. Lowlanders who knew the stories but dismissed them as backward superstition. They were practical people, drawn by the cheap, fertile land near the loch. They built a new croft on the eastern side, not far from where the old purification had been attempted. They had a son, a bold, curious boy of 12 named Finn. The elders of the glen, their faces lined with the memory of old fears, warned the new family. They spoke in hushed tones of the water horse, of the missing children, of the MacLeod girl. The new father, a man named Douglas, laughed it off. "Stories to frighten bairns," he said. "We are not afeard of shadows in the water." But Finn was captivated. Unlike the local children who were raised on a diet of terror, he saw the legend as an adventure. He would sneak away to the loch, much like Elspeth had, though his motivation was not solace, but thrill-seeking. He would throw stones into the black water, daring the monster to appear. The Kelpie observed this new human with a flicker of its ancient interest. The boy's energy was not one of sorrow or devotion, but of reckless challenge. It was a different flavor, thin but sharp. For years, it simply watched him grow from a boy into a young man, his forays to the loch becoming less frequent as the responsibilities of adulthood encroached. When Finn was 18, a great drought fell upon the highlands. The rivers shrank to trickles. The crops withered in the fields. The water level of Loch Dew, for the first time in living memory, began to drop, revealing a grim, stony shore that had been submerged for centuries. It was Finn who found it. He was searching the newly exposed shoreline for anything of value, lost fishing lures perhaps, or interesting stones. His foot struck something that was not rock. It was smooth and pale. Brushing away the wet silt, he uncovered a human skull. He recoiled, a superstitious chill running down his spine despite his modern skepticism. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He kept digging, carefully. He uncovered a partial skeleton, the bones laid out in the silt as if the person had been simply lying on the loch bed. It was not the complete articulated skeleton of a recent drowning. These bones were ancient, stained dark by the peat and water. Among the ribs, something gleamed, untouched by time. It was a locket, a simple, tarnished silver locket. With trembling fingers, Finn pried it open. The portrait inside was faded, but the face was still clear. A young woman with hair the color of rusted bracken and eyes the soft gray of a winter sea. He had never seen her before, but he knew her instantly from the stories. It was Elspeth MacLeod. The discovery sent a shockwave through the glen, reopening the old wound. The legend was no longer a story. It was archaeology. The physical evidence of the tragedy made it more real, more terrible for the new generation than it had been for the one that lived through it. An old, forgotten great-aunt of Finn's, who remembered the tales from her own childhood, looked at the locket and whispered a fragment of the story he had never heard. "They say she loved it," the old woman murmured, her eyes cloudy with memory. "They say she went to it willingly, thinking it loved her back." This detail transformed the legend for Finn. It was no longer a simple monster story. It was a story of deception, of loneliness, of the terrible cost of believing a beautiful lie. He took the locket and, without telling his parents, rowed a small boat to the deepest part of the loch. He did not throw it in. He lowered it gently over the side, watching it sink back into the darkness. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the water, though he did not know who he was apologizing to, the girl, the monster, or the glen itself. The Kelpie, from the depths, watched the locket sink. It felt a distant, muted echo of the emotions it had once consumed. It was a ghost of a feeling, a whisper from a past it could not change. It did not understand the boy's gesture, but it felt the intention, a gesture of peace, of closure. The drought eventually broke. The rains returned, and the water level of Loch Dew rose, once again covering its secrets. But something had shifted. The legend now had a new ending, a coda of pity and understanding. The Kelpie remained, a permanent feature of the landscape, but its power to terrorize was diminished, replaced by a melancholic mystique. It was no longer just a monster. It was a monument to a specific, tragic love, a cautionary tale carved not in stone, but in the collective memory of water and wind. Its legacy was no longer one of pure fear, but of a sorrow so deep it had become a part of the land itself. The Echo in the Abyss. The decades following the discovery of Elspeth's locket settled into a new, quieter era for the glen. The world outside was changing, hurtling towards a new century with steam and steel, but the valley containing Loch Dew remained a pocket of arrested time. The fear of the Kelpie softened, its edges worn smooth by the passage of years, transforming into a respectful and somber tradition. Parents no longer used it to threaten disobedience with a sharp, immediate terror. Instead, they spoke of it in the same hushed tones they used for family graves, a sad story from a bygone age. The creature itself became a more distant presence. It still appeared occasionally, a dark shape seen far out on the water at dusk, a fleeting impression of a horse's head breaking the surface before vanishing. But the aggressive, predatory lure seemed to have left it. It was as if the act of consuming Elspeth MacLeod had been both its pinnacle and its conclusion. The hunger was a dull echo, the drive to hunt replaced by a vast, inertial stillness. It existed, a sentient part of the loch's ecosystem, but its purpose had been fulfilled and, in its fulfillment, extinguished. Its consciousness, once focused solely on the anticipation and execution of the kill, now turned inward. It drifted through the sunless canyons of the loch's depths, past the skeletal remains of the old kobold, past the scattered bones of its victims, including the small, delicate frame of Elspeth, now picked clean by water and time and lying peaceful and anonymous among the rest. It no longer derived pleasure from these memories. They were simply facts, items in a ledger. The intense, vibrant emotions it had stolen from Elspeth, the grief, the love, the betrayal, had been metabolized, leaving behind only their ghostly aftertaste. This aftertaste was the problem. It was a lingering resonance, a complex emotional signature it could not fully digest. Before Elspeth, its victims had offered simple, primal fear. Their terror was a pure, sharp note. Elspeth had been a symphony, and now, in the silence of its existence, it found itself remembering the music. It would recall the specific timbre of her voice when she spoke of her mother, the warmth that radiated from her when she felt understood, the devastating coldness of her final, betrayed look. These were not nourishing memories, they were haunting ones. They were the echoes of a connection it had destroyed, and for the first time in its interminable life, the Kelpie experienced something akin to regret. Not remorse for the act, but a dim understanding that in achieving its ultimate goal, it had irrevocably diminished the quality of its own eternity. On the surface, the world continued its slow march. Finn, the boy who had found the locket, grew into a man, married a girl from a neighboring glen, and took over his father's croft. He never forgot his encounter with the past. He often found himself looking out at the loch, not with fear, but with a profound and melancholy curiosity. He felt a responsibility to the story, a need to ensure it was remembered not as a sensational ghost story, but as a human tragedy. He began to write it down. In the evenings, by the flickering light of a paraffin lamp, he would take out a ledger and, in his careful, unpracticed script, record every detail he had gathered from the old ones in the glen. He wrote of Hamish's silent grief, of the community's poisonous fear, of Reverend Moore's shattered faith, and he wrote of Elspeth, not as a witch or a victim, but as a lonely, grieving girl who had sought solace in the wrong place. He tried to capture the complexity, the way the monster and the girl had been mirrors for each other's loneliness, each reflecting a terrible void back at the other. He did not write a history, he wrote a eulogy. For a girl, for a family, for a certain kind of innocence in the glen. One autumn evening, us Finns sat writing. A fierce storm gathered over the mountains. It was not a common squall, but a bruise-purged tempest that seemed to carry the anger of the old gods. The wind howled with a voice that sounded like forgotten screams, and the rain fell in horizontal sheets, lashing the roof of the croft. Lightning fractured the sky, and in the instantaneous, blinding illumination, Finn saw the loch churning like a cauldron, its black water whipped into a frenzy. Down in the depths, the storm was a distant, muffled fury. But the energy it stirred, the raw, untamed power of the wind and waves, resonated with the Kelpie. It felt a stirring of its own ancient power, a memory of the force it had wielded to create the phantom ship. It rose from the abyssal plain, swimming upwards through the dark water, drawn by the chaos above. It broke the surface in the midst of the storm's peak. The world was a maelstrom of noise and violence. The Kelpie, a creature of water and storm, was in its element. It rode the massive waves, its form solid and real amidst the chaos, no longer a lure, but a manifestation of the loch's wild heart. Lightning flashed, and for a split second it was illuminated. A colossal jet-black steed, its mane and tail streaming not just with water, but with the very energy of the gale, its eyes blazing like captured lightning. In that moment, it was not a deceiver, but a truth, a primal, elemental force, beautiful and terrible in its pure, undiluted power. Finn, watching from his window, saw it. He saw the Kelpie not us a monster preying on children, but us as a king reclaiming its storm-racked throne. The sight filled him not with fear, but with a staggering awe. He understood then that the stories had only ever told half the tale. The Kelpie was not just a predator, it was the spirit of the loch itself. Its darkness, its depth, its capacity for both profound stillness and raging violence. Elspeth had only ever seen one facet of it, the facet it had chosen to show her. Suddenly, it had begun, the storm passed. The wind died, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky full of cold, sharp stars. The Kelpie, its moment of wild glory over, settled back into the water. It floated for a time, its great head lifted towards the starry expanse, and then it slowly sank beneath the now placid surface, returning to the silence and the echoes. Finn put down his pen. He knew his record was complete. The storm had provided the final chapter. The legacy of the Kelpie was not a single story of a drowning, but the ongoing story of the loch itself. A story of deep, enduring sorrow, of terrible beauty, and of a loneliness so vast it could swallow storms and stars and the souls of girls, leaving behind only echoes in the abyss. The last patient hunt. A century flowed over the glen like a slow-moving glacier. The great wars came and went, their distant thunder a faint rumor in the high, quiet valley. The crofting way of life, already ailing, finally succumbed. The last of the families, descendants of those who had thrown offal and prayed with Reverend Moore, eventually moved away to the cities or to lands across the sea, seeking a life less bound to the stubborn soil and the long, dark memories. The stones of their homes slowly sank back into the earth, reclaimed by heather and moss. Loch Dew was left in an isolation more complete than any it had known before. It became a destination only for the occasional hiker or birdwatcher, people with laminated maps and synthetic jackets, who sallow its beauty as a photograph, its silence as a lack of noise. They would pause, eat a sandwich on the shore once trod by Elspeth, and move on, utterly unaware of the layers of sorrow and legend upon which they stood. They spoke in cheerful, normal voices, their emotions simple and transient, their fears limited to midges or a sudden change in the weather. The Kelpie observed these new humans from the depths. Their emotions were like the faint, chattering calls of sparrows, brief, simple, and unnourishing. It had no desire to hunt them. The elaborate, patient lure of the beautiful horse felt like a ritual from a forgotten religion, a dance whose steps it no longer remembered with any passion. Its existence had become one of pure observation, a timeless, near-vegetative state at the cold heart of the world. Yet, the memory of Elspeth MacLeod persisted within it, not as a consuming pain, but as a permanent, low-grade temperature, a scar on its consciousness. She had been the one who had changed its nature, not through her death, but through the complexity of the life she had offered it. She had introduced it to a world of emotional nuance it had not known existed, and in doing so had ruined the simple economy of fear that had sustained it for so long. One late afternoon, a figure appeared on the old path, a path now barely visible as a slight depression in the heather. It was not a hiker. It was an old woman, moving with the slow, deliberate care of age, supported by a gnarled walking stick. She was dressed in simple, worn clothing, and her face was a web of fine lines, but her eyes, a soft, winter sea gray, were sharp and clear. She was the last living descendant of the Glen, a great-granddaughter of Finn, who had come back one last time, drawn by the family story that had been passed down through the generations, along with Finn's carefully preserved ledger. Her name was Morag. She had been born in a city, surrounded by concrete and noise. But the story of the loch and the lonely girl had always been the bedrock of her identity. She had come to see the place for herself before she died, to pay her respects to the ghost that was not a ghost, but a memory. She settled herself on a large, flat rock, the same rock Elspeth had used a century and a half before. The vibe was one of profound peace, a quiet acceptance that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil that had once defined this shore. She did not speak. She simply sat, her hands resting on her knees, and looked out over the dark, still water, feeling the weight of the past settle around her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Deep below, the Kelpie felt her presence. It was not the vibrant, desperate energy of Elspeth, nor the challenging thrill of the boy Finn, nor the simple chatter of the hikers. This was a different frequency altogether, a deep, resonant calm, an emotion weathered smooth by a long life, tinged with a gentle, accepting sadness. It was a feeling of closure. Intrigued by this unique emotional signature, the Kelpie began to rise. It moved slowly, its form pulling itself from the silt of the loch bed. It did not shape itself into the magnificent Lure stallion. That deception felt hollow, irrelevant for this visitor. Instead, it allowed its form to remain somewhat nebulous, a dark, man-shaped concentration of water and shadow, a thing of shifting outlines and dripping silence. It was a closer representation of its true elemental self than the beautiful horse had ever been. It emerged from the water without a sound, standing knee-deep in the loch, 20 yards from where the old woman sat. Morag did not startle. She did not cry out. She simply turned her head and looked at the figure, her expression one of quiet recognition, as if she had been expecting it. "So," she said, her voice raspy with age but steady, "you are still here." The Kelpie stood, water streaming from its vague form. It had no voice with which to answer, but it communicated nonetheless, a pressure in the air, a focusing of its attention that Morag could feel against her skin. "I have come a long way to see you," she continued, as if conversing with an old acquaintance. "I have read the story. My great-grandfather wrote it down. He thought it was important that we remember, not the monster, but the girl and the Glen." The Kelpie listened. The words themselves were less important than the emotion behind them. There was no fear, only a deep, abiding pity and a sense of history. It was a sensation it had never experienced from a human before. "She thought you could love her," Morag said softly, her gaze unwavering. "And in your own way, I think you did. Not as a man loves a woman, but as a fire loves the air that feeds it. It was the only way you knew." This concept, this interpretation of its nature, settled into the Kelpie's consciousness. It was not true, not in a literal sense, But it was a truth shaped by a human heart trying to find meaning in tragedy. And in that moment, the Kelpie understood that its legacy was not just the fear it inspired, but the stories it spawned, the lives it had indirectly shaped across generations. Morag was as much a product of its existence as the bones in the silt. It took a step forward, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. The water swirled around its indistinct legs. Morag smiled, a small, sad, wise smile. "It's all right," she whispered. "You can rest now. The hunt is over." She remained there for a long time, sitting in silence with the creature, as the twilight deepened into night. There was no lure, no fear, no taking. It was a vigil, a final, quiet meeting between the legacy of the haunted and the source of the haunting. When the moon rose, painting its silver road on the water, the Kelpie slowly dissolved back into the loch, its form merging with the darkness until there was nothing left but the star-filled reflection on the black surface. Morag eventually rose, her bones stiff, and made her way back up the path. She had gotten what she came for. She had looked into the water's false heart and had found not a monster, but a lonely, enduring truth. And deep in the loch, the Kelpie felt the last connection to the world of men sever. The old woman's calm acceptance was the final, perfect sustenance. The hunger that had defined it was, at long last, truly gone. Its long, patient hunt was over. It had finally been found, and in being found, it was finally, completely alone. And for the first time, the loneliness was not a hollow ache, but a state of peace. The slow dissolution. With Morag's departure, a final, silent door closed on the history of Loch Dhu. The last living thread of emotional connection to its story had been severed, leaving the glen and its inhabitant in a state of profound and absolute quietus. The world continued its frantic pace elsewhere, but here time seemed to slow, then still, like water approaching the freezing point. The Kelpie entered an era of unprecedented passivity. The drives that had governed its existence for centuries, the gnawing hunger, the compulsion to lure, the anticipation of the kill, faded into a distant memory, like the echo of a stone dropped into the loch long ago. It no longer rose to the surface to observe the changing seasons or the rare, oblivious human visitor. It remained in the profound darkness of the deep, a sentient statue amidst the ruins of its own history. Its form began to change. Without the will to maintain the beautiful, deceptive shape of the stallion, it started to relax its hold on that specific manifestation. The defined lines of legs, neck, and head softened. The jet-black coat lost its solidity, becoming more translucent, merging with the surrounding water. It was reverting, not to the shambling horror of its first attempt, but to something closer to its original state, a concentration of consciousness, a gathering of water and memory without a fixed shape. It was becoming one with the loch it had haunted for so long. Its thoughts, once sharp with predatory intent, became slow, vast, and diffuse. It no longer thought in terms of individuals or events, but in terms of epochs and elements. The memory of Elspeth's face was no longer a vivid picture, but a sensation of warmth and light, a brief, bright flare in the long, cold night of its existence. The terror of its victims was a mineral taste in the water, a permanent, faint stain on the fabric of the loch. It did not regret, it simply was. It was the sum of all it had consumed and all it had witnessed, a library of emotions written in water and stored in the dark. Seasons turned in a blur above. The heather on the hills bloomed purple and died back 100 times. Storms raged and calmed. Snow capped the mountains and melted into rushing burns. The Kelpie felt these changes not as distinct events, but as shifts in pressure and temperature, a slow, rhythmic breathing of the world. It was less a creature in the loch and more the loch's own dreaming mind. A new kind of visitor began to appear in the glen. Surveyors with tripods and theodolites, men in stiff new boots who spoke of hydroelectric power and regional development. They took measurements of the loch's depth, its volume, the flow of its feeder streams. They spoke in practical, unromantic terms about concrete, turbines, and drowned valleys. They were utterly ignorant of the legacy they were probing, their emotions a bland mixture of professional curiosity and ambition. The Kelpie felt their presence as a faint vibrational annoyance, a buzzing on the surface of its awareness. It understood, on a primal level, that they represented a threat far greater than any preacher with a Bible or crofter with a basket of offal. This was not an attack on its being, but an attack on its place. It was the logic of the new world, a world with no room for spirits or legends, a world that saw the loch not as a heart, but as a reservoir. Yet it had no will left to fight. The energy required to manifest, to threaten, to defend its domain was beyond its current state. It could only wait, a dormant intelligence in the path of an oncoming, indifferent machine. One of the surveyors, a young engineer named David, was different. He was efficient and capable, but he possessed a poetic streak that his colleagues teased him about. While the others saw a challenging topography and a difficult pour for the proposed dam, David felt the atmosphere of the place. The profound silence of the glen. The way the mountains seemed to lean in protectively around the black water. The sheer weight of the stillness, it affected him. On his last day of the survey, he stayed behind after the others had packed up the Land Rover. He sat on the shore, much like so many others had before him, and simply looked out over Loch Dew. He knew nothing of Kelpies or missing girls. He only felt a deep, inexplicable sadness, a melancholy that seemed to seep from the water itself into his bones. It was a feeling of ancient loss, of a story that had been forgotten so completely that only its emotional residue remained. He picked up a smooth gray stone, its surface worn by centuries of water. He weighed it in his hand. Then, on an impulse, he didn't throw it. Instead, he bent down and gently placed it at the water's edge, a small, meaningless gesture of respect for a feeling he could not name. Deep below, the Kelpie felt this small, gentle action. The intention behind it, a flicker of reverence, an unconscious acknowledgement of the loch's presence, was a sensation it had not felt since Morag's visit. It was a pinprick of light in its vast, dark consciousness. It did not respond. It had no means to, and no desire. But it registered the gesture, filing it away with the other, rare, non-predatory human interactions in its long, long memory. David left, and the glen was silent once more. The reports were written, the proposals made. But the project, like many, was eventually shelved due to funding and logistical challenges. The threat receded. Loch Dew was, for the moment, saved by the very obscurity and inconvenience that had defined it for centuries. The Kelpie, unaware of its reprieve, continued its slow dissolution. Its consciousness spread, thinning out, becoming less a centralized self and more a pervasive mood in the water. The legend was dying, not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet fading, a return to the elemental. It was the last, patient hunt for its own end, emerging with the vast, uncaring beauty from which it had been born. The whisper in the water. A millennium is a long time, even for a loch. The climate shifted subtly. The patterns of rain and snow changed. The glacier that had once carved the deep basin of Loch Dew retreated further into the high corries, its meltwater feeding the loch a little less each year. The water level, over centuries, began a slow, inexorable retreat, exposing ever more of the stony, barren shore. The Kelpie was now barely a coherent entity. Its consciousness was a diffuse awareness, a sentient quality to the water itself. It was the chill in the deep current, the strange, sudden stillness that could fall on the surface on a windless day, the fleeting impression of a face seen in the ripples. It was no longer a thing that could interact with the world. It was a feeling the world evoked. The ruins of the crofts were long gone, completely subsumed by peat and heather. The paths were erased. The names, MacLeod, Mackay, Ferguson, were forgotten. Their stories dissolved into the generic folklore of the region. The glen was designated a national nature reserve, valued for its rare bog orchids and nesting birds of prey. Visitors came on prescribed trails, their movements gentle and regulated, their impact minimal. They spoke in hushed voices, not from fear, but from a sense of being in a pristine cathedral of nature. One such visitor was a young woman named Anya, a PhD student in ecology. She was conducting a survey of the loch's microbial life, taking core samples from the sediment. She was a woman of science, her worldview built on data, genetics, and chemical analysis. To her, the loch was a fascinating, complex ecosystem, a record of environmental change written in layers of silt. She worked from a small, inflatable boat, her movements precise and practiced. She lowered a coring device into the water, sending it deep into the soft, accumulated history on the loch bed. When she pulled it up, the cylinder was filled with a column of dark, layered muck. Back in her temporary field station, a small, solar-powered pod, she began her analysis. Under the microscope, the sediment revealed its secrets: pollen grains from long-vanished forests, ash from ancient wildfires, the microscopic shells of diatoms. It was a history book written in a language she was trained to read. But in one sample, from the deepest, oldest layer of silt, she found something that did not fit. It was a concentration of mineral deposits unlike anything she had seen, forming a strange, almost crystalline structure around a cluster of organic matter. It was as if the very chemistry of the water had been altered by a powerful, localized emotional event. She ran further tests, but the results were inconclusive, bordering on the anomalous. The data seemed to suggest a brief, intense release of energy that had fundamentally changed the composition of the sediment at that specific point in time. Puzzled, she took a break, stepping outside her pod to look at the loch. The evening was calm, the water a perfect mirror for the fiery sunset. The vibe was one of profound peace and ancient mystery. Us, a scientist, she dismissed the old folk tales she had skimmed in her preparatory research as pre-scientific attempts to explain the unknown. Yet the anomalous data nagged at her. It was a ghost in the machine, a story the land itself was telling that didn't fit the established narrative. That night, she dreamed. It was a vivid, sensory dream. She was standing on the shore, but the water was higher, lapping at the bases of hills that were now bare. She saw a girl with rust-colored hair weeping. She saw a magnificent black horse, its eyes glowing with a lonely intelligence. She felt a profound, soul-crushing grief and a betrayal so sharp it was a physical pain. And through it all, she felt the loch, not as a body of water, but as a witness, a participant, a creature that felt and remembered. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the emotions of the dream clinging to her like cobwebs. It felt more like a memory than a dream, a memory that was not her own. The next day, she returned to the deep water core sample. She looked at the anomalous data again, and now she saw it not as a chemical puzzle, but as a signature. It was the fossilized residue of a catastrophic emotional event. The science and the legend were not in conflict. They were describing the same phenomenon in different languages. The stories of the water horse were the human interpretation of a real, measurable, elemental trauma that had been imprinted on this place. She never published this particular interpretation. It had no place in a peer-reviewed journal, but it changed her. She finished her PhD, she moved on to other projects, but she never forgot Loch Dew. She had heard the whisper in the water, the last faint echo of the Kelpie story, not as a myth, but as a permanent geological truth. And deep in the loch, the last vestige of the Kelpie's concentrated self, the part that had held the memory of Elspeth, finally dissolved. The energy that had sustained it for so long was exhausted. Its consciousness completed its diffusion, spreading evenly through the millions of gallons of water, until the I became a we, and then became simply the loch. The Kelpie was gone. It had not been slain by a hero. It had not been banished by a saint. It had simply been forgotten, its purpose fulfilled, its story complete. It had returned to the state from which it had emerged, the cold, dark, beautiful water of Loch Dew. The legend was over. Only the loch remained, holding the memory not in a spirit, but in its very atoms, in the weight of its water and the silence of its depths, a whisper that would never fully fade, as long as the water met the shore, and the wind stirred the surface into ripples that told wordless, ancient stories. The unwritten epilogue. The silence that settled over Loch Dew after the dissolution of the Kelpie was not the silence of absence, but of integration. The entity was gone, its predatory consciousness dissipated like mist under a morning sun, but its essence had become a fundamental component of the loch's character. The water did not forget. It simply ceased to narrate the story from a single, monstrous point of view. The legacy was now woven into the landscape itself, a permanent, subtle alteration in the fabric of the place. Centuries continued their slow, geological march. The glen witnessed the gentle pressures of the new millennium. The nature reserve status protected it from development, but it could not protect it from the slow, global shifts in climate. The air grew marginally warmer, the winters less severe. The heather line crept slowly up the mountainsides, and the composition of the microbial life in the loch shifted in response, a change that would have fascinated the scientist Anya. The human relationship with the loch evolved into something entirely new. It became a place of pilgrimage for a different kind of seeker. These were not historians or folklorists. but individuals drawn by an intangible quality they could not name. They spoke of the lock's profound stillness, its ability to quiet the mind. They did not come to hunt for monsters or to prove legends. They came to listen. A man named Liam, a composer plagued by a creative block, spent a week in a small bothy on the eastern shore. He had come because of a vague feeling, a pull he could not explain. For days he sat by the water, his notebook empty, his mind a jumble of dissonant chords. He felt nothing but frustration. On his final evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he stopped trying. He simply let the silence of the glen press against him. And in that silence, he began to hear music, not with his ears, but in his mind. It was a slow, melancholic air, a melody built from the lap of water on stone, the sigh of the wind through the heather, the vast empty space between the stars. It was a song of loneliness, but also of endurance. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. He scrambled for his notebook, his pen flying across the page, capturing the notes before they faded. The piece he composed, Lament for Loch Dew, would later be hailed as his masterpiece, a work that captured a specific, ineffable sorrow that listeners felt they had always known but had never before heard expressed. The Kelpie did not compose the music. The loch did not whisper the notes into Liam's ear. Rather, the accumulated emotional residue of the place, the sum of all the grief, love, fear, and betrayal that had been poured into its waters, had created a unique emotional frequency. Liam, in his state of open receptivity, had tuned into it. He had translated the loch's mood into sound. A few years later, a woman named Sienna visited. She was a therapist recovering from a personal loss that had left her feeling hollowed out and disconnected. She walked the permitted trails but found no solace. On a whim, she found a secluded spot, a small stony beach where a tiny burn trickled into the great loch. She sat and, remembering a childhood game, began stacking stones, building a small, precarious cairn. As she worked, her mind quieted. The analytical part of her brain, always diagnosing and categorizing, grew still. She focused only on the balance of the stones, the cool, rough texture under her fingers. When she finished, she looked at her simple, anonymous creation, and then out at the vast, dark water. A feeling washed over her, not of happiness, but of acceptance. It was a feeling that her grief was not a unique, personal failing, but a part of a larger, universal pattern of loss and continuity. The loch had seen so much of it. Her own sorrow felt smaller here, not diminished, but contextualized, held in a vessel large enough to contain it without breaking. She did not know the story of Elspeth MacLeod. She did not need to. The loch, imprinted with the memory of that specific long-ago grief, offered a form of solace that was wordless and direct. It was a therapy of place, a silent understanding that predated psychology. These interactions became the new, unwritten epilogue to the Kelpie's tale. The creature was gone, but its impact had rippled outwards through time, transforming the loch from a place of active fear into a place of passive, profound healing. The predator was gone, but the ecosystem of emotion it had helped create remained, a lasting, paradoxical monument to its existence. The lure had been transformed. Where once a beautiful horse had promised strength and companionship only to deliver death, the loch now promised only silence and stillness, and in return it offered a strange, unexpected form of life, creative inspiration, emotional peace, a connection to a deeper, older rhythm than the frantic pace of the modern world. The legacy was no longer a warning. It was a gift. The water's false heart had, through the alchemy of time, become a true heart, one that did not beat with a single purpose, but which resonated with the myriad sorrows and solaces of all who came to its shore, listening for the echoes of a story they would never know, but whose emotional truth they felt in their bones. The final form. Time, in its most profound sense, began to lose its meaning at the lock. The cycles of day and night, summer and winter continued their celestial dance. But the deep, internal time of the place became a single, sustained note. The Kelpie's consciousness was now fully integrated. Its I dissolved into the isness of the water, the stone, the air. It was no longer a spirit in the glen. It was the glen. The slow retreat of the water level continued, a process measured not in years but in millennia. The shorelines of the past were now high terraces, covered in a thick skin of peat and hardy brass. The deep central trench of the loch remained, but its area shrank, its black waters concentrating, becoming even darker, even more profound. The world of men changed in ways that would be incomprehensible to Hamish MacLeod or even to the scientist Anya. Great cities of crystal and light rose and fell elsewhere, their histories barely causing a tremor in the high, quiet valley. The nature reserve designation was forgotten, superseded by newer, grander conservation efforts on a planetary scale. The glen was simply left alone, not out of reverence, but out of a lack of interest. It was too remote, too geologically stable, too devoid of resources to be of any use. It became a blank spot on the map, a place of pure, unmanaged wilderness. The climate shifts became more pronounced. The glaciers in the high corries vanished entirely. The patterns of rainfall became erratic, followed by long, deep droughts. The feeder streams that had once gushed with snowmelt became seasonal trickles, and then, for long periods, dried up completely. The level of Loch Dew dropped precipitously, revealing vast new expanses of its stony bed, a landscape that had not seen the sun since before the first humans walked the land. The water that remained was a precious, shrinking jewel of blackness, superbly cold and clear, holding on in the deepest part of the basin. The vibe of the place shifted from one of melancholic stillness to one of stark, elemental fragility. It was a world in its final act, a stage being slowly dismantled. Within this last, deep pool, the final, faint echo of the Kelpie's self stirred. It was not a return to consciousness, but a gathering of memory, a last consolidation before the end. As the water volume decreased, the emotional residue concentrated, becoming more potent. The countless sensations it had absorbed over the millennia, the simple terror of the drowned, the complex symphony of Elspeth, the calm of Morag, the reverence of the stone placer, the creative spark of the composer, the healing silence for the therapist, all pressed together, a library collapsing in on itself. And in this final, pressurized state, a new form began to emerge from the remaining water. It was not the beautiful, deceptive stallion. It was not the shifting, man-shaped shadow. It was something entirely new, the true, final form of the entity, stripped of all artifice and purpose. It was a figure woven from water and light, but a light that was cold and depthless, like the glow of submerged ice. It had the general shape of a woman, but its features were indistinct, a face seen through a rain-streaked window. Its hair was a flowing cascade of the loch's dark water, and its body was a constellation of captured memories, flickering moments of joy, fear, love, and despair from every soul it had ever touched, all playing out simultaneously across its form. It was neither beautiful nor terrifying. It was a truth. It was the living history of the loch, given a temporary, fleeting shape. This form did not walk or speak. It simply stood on the surface of the last remaining pool, a mirage made real, a monument to everything that had happened here. It was the story, told all at once. There was no one to see it. The birds had moved to wetter valleys. The hikers and seekers were a memory of a memory. The figure stood in absolute solitude, under a sky that was often a hard, cloudless blue, or filled with stars of impossible clarity. It stood for a day or for a century. Time had no meaning here. It was a final, silent performance for an audience of mountains and sky. It was the loch remembering itself. Then the last of the water began to go. The sun and the dry wind worked upon the dark pool, shrinking it hour by hour. The figure began to fade, its form becoming more translucent, the memories flickering more slowly. The concentration of emotion was too great to be sustained without the medium of the water to hold it. As the pool diminished to a mere puddle, the figure knelt, then dissolved. It did not sink or fall. It simply unwound, the water that composed it returning to the pool, the memories releasing back into the air like a final, silent exhalation. The last coherent thought, if it could be called a thought, was not a word or an image, but a sensation. The feeling of a girl's hand, warm and trusting, resting on a cool, wet neck. The final drop of water evaporated, leaving only a patch of damp, dark silt in the very center of the vast, dry basin of Loch Dew. The legacy was complete. The story was over. The glen was silent, not with the silence of waiting, but with the silence of conclusion. The wind blew across the empty stone, carrying no whispers, telling no tales. The water's false heart had finally and truly stopped beating. The empty basin. The final evaporation of Loch Dew did not leave behind a scene of death, but one of profound and absolute revelation. The great basin, which had held its dark secret for millennia, was now laid bare to the sky. It was a colossal, stony wound in the flesh of the earth, a perfect bowl of exposed geology. The vibe was no longer one of water-deep mystery, but of airy, desolate exposure. The sun, which had once struggled to penetrate the black water, now beat down upon the bedrock with an unforgiving intensity, bleaching the stones a pale, bone gray. The wind, which had once whispered across a surface, now howled unimpeded through the vast, empty arena, scouring the dust and carrying away the last minute particles of the loch's physical being. The process of drying was achingly slow, a geological sigh. The deepest part of the basin, where the last pool had held on, became a hard pan of cracked, blackish silt. This silt was the final, concentrated essence of the loch, the compacted remains of countless water plants, the microscopic shells of diatoms, the dissolved peat, and the infinitesimal mineralized particles of all the emotions that had been poured into it. It was a dark, circular stain, the ghost of the water's heart pressed into the earth. With the protective blanket of water gone, the other, older residents of the loch were also exposed. The wreck of the ancient cobble, which had rested in the silty dark for ages, was now a skeletal arrangement of waterlogged, blackened timbers, its shape barely discernible before it began to warp and splinter in the dry air. And there were the bones. They were not laid out in neat anatomical order. Centuries of water currents, the gentle but persistent work of decay, and the shifting of the silt had scattered them, mingling them together in a final, democratic repose. A child's small rib cage rested near the long, heavy femur of a clansman. A skull, smoothed by time and water, lay half embedded in the dried mud, its empty sockets staring at a sun it was never meant to see. They were no longer the remains of individuals with names and stories. They were a collective fossil bed, a midden of tragedy, all identity erased by the great leveler of time. The seasons began their work of dissolution. The winter frosts pried at the cracked silt, fracturing it into smaller and smaller pieces. The spring rains, when they came, were no longer absorbed and stored. They fell upon the barren stone and ran off in 1,000 temporary, frantic rivulets, carrying the loosened silt and dust down the glen, scattering the physical memory of the loch across a wider and wider area. A particularly violent storm might dislodge a skull, sending it tumbling down the rocky slope to shatter into fragments that were then ground into powder by the elements. The Kelpie was gone. Its consciousness had evaporated with the last drop of water. But its legacy, in the most literal physical sense, was now subject to the same entropic forces. The bones that were its testament were being erased. The stain of its home was being washed away. It was an unmaking, a systematic deconstruction of a world. The glen itself began to change character. Without the vast, cooling mass of the loch to influence the local climate, the temperature extremes became more pronounced. The damp, peat-rich soil of the shores dried out and hardened. The specific mosses and liverworts that thrived in the perpetual damp of the loch's edge withered and died, their spores finding no purchase on the dry stone. New, hardier, drought-resistant lichens began to colonize the exposed basin, painting the stones in slow-spreading patches of orange and gray. The ecosystem was not dying. It was transitioning, adapting to the new, arid reality. The locus of life moved away from the center of the glen, clinging to the higher slopes where the last moisture could be found. Centuries passed in this slow, patient work of erasure. The basin remained, a stark and imposing geographical feature, but its story was fading from the very stone. The wind-blown dust that had once been the silt of Loch Dhu was now just part of the topsoil further down the valley. The powdered bone fragments were incorporated into the earth, their calcium leaching out to be taken up by the roots of stubborn, wind-bent pines. The timbers of the cobble crumbled into a dark, rich humus that nourished a patch of bellheather. A traveler standing in the center of the basin now would feel a profound emptiness, but not a haunted one. The feeling was not of a presence that had left, but of a space that had been vacated for so long that the memory of occupancy was itself a memory. The mountains still stood guard, but they were no longer guarding a secret. They were simply there, immense and indifferent. The wind no longer carried whispers of drowned souls. It was just moving air, shaped by the contours of the land. The water was gone. The monster was gone. The people were gone. All that remained was the shape of the absence, the vast, silent bowl under the sky, a monument to nothing but its own existence. The finality was absolute. The story, it seemed, had reached its end not with a climax, but with a slow, inexorable fading to gray, a return to the elemental silence that had preceded it. The page was not just turned, it was bleaching in the sun, its ink fading, on the verge of becoming blank once more. The last echo. Time, in its most abstract sense, became the only true resident of the glen. Millennia folded into epochs. The continents, on their slow, tectonic journeys, shifted imperceptibly. The climate of the world cycled through ages of ice and warmth. The glen, its dry basin now a permanent feature, endured it all. It was scoured by glaciers that carved fresh striations into its ancient bedrock, then buried under layers of glacial till when the ice retreated. Forests rose, flourished, and were burned away by fires started by lightning strikes. The world changed in ways that would have rendered it unrecognizable to any of its previous inhabitants. A new intelligence eventually walked the earth. They were not human, not in the sense that Hamish or Elspeth would have understood. Their relationship with the world was fundamentally different, built on a symbiosis of biology and technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic, or perhaps a new form of nature. They were stewards, cartographers of reality on a quantum level. They called themselves the Listeners. A small team of them came to the glen. They were not drawn by legend, no such stories had survived the intervening ages, but by an anomaly. Their planetary scans had detected a persistent, faint, non-physical resonance in this location, a subtle kink in the fabric of local spacetime, a memory echo that defied their understanding of entropy. It was a whisper of structured information that had, against all odds, refused to completely dissipate. The team, led by a being named Kyle, stood on the rim of the Great Basin. It was no longer barren. It was now a lush, high-altitude meadow filled with a bioluminescent moss that glowed a soft blue in the twilight. A stream, a mere trickle compared to the ancient loch, wound its way across the floor, finding a new path through the accumulated debris of ages. The vibe was one of serene, alien beauty. "This is the place," Kyle said, his voice not a sound, but a complex modulation of energy that his team could interpret. "The echo is faint, but it is here. It is layered like sediment." The most recent layers are simple, geological shifts, climatic data. But beneath them, there is something else, something complex and emotional. One of his team, a specialist in resonant archaeology, extended a delicate, crystalline apparatus. It hummed, sending out pulses of sympathetic energy, reading the shape of the emptiness. The data is corrupted, faded. It is not a narrative. It is more like a perfume of feeling. I am detecting patterns consistent with what the ancients classified as grief and love and a profound, enduring loneliness. Kale closed his sensory orbs, allowing the raw data to flow into his consciousness. He did not see images or hear words. He felt sensations, a cold, pressing weight, The thrilling, terrifying beauty of a flawless deception, the warmth of a hand on a wet neck, the shattering cold of ultimate betrayal, the quiet peace of an old woman's acceptance. It was a chaotic symphony of feeling, all jumbled together, their sources long since vanished, but their emotional fingerprints miraculously preserved in the very quantum foam of the place. "It is not one story," Cale communicated, his own energy field tinged with wonder. "It is the ghost of many stories, all centered on this location. They have overlapped, merged, and decayed into this emotional fossil. They worked for days, carefully amplifying and separating the faintest strands of the echo. They could not recover names or faces. They could not reconstruct events, but they could map the emotional topography of the site. They created a model, a shimmering three-dimensional lattice of light that hovered over the meadow. Within this lattice, certain points glowed more brightly, representing moments of intense emotional discharge. One point, deep in the center where the last pool had been, glowed with a cold, possessive hunger. Wrapped around it, like a vine around a dark tree, was a strand of such profound and complex sorrow, it made Cale's energy field flicker with a sympathetic dissonance. It was a sorrow woven from love, trust, and desolation. "This one," the specialist said, indicating the complex strand, "it is the strongest individual signature. It feels pivotal. It is the knot that ties all the other echoes together." Cale focused on it. He could not know her name was Elspeth. He could not know she had hair the color of rusted bracken. But he felt the essence of her, a being capable of great love and great misunderstanding, whose life and death had somehow become the emotional core of this place for millennia. They could not stay. Their work was one of recording, not of intervention. They gathered their data, stored the complex emotional signature in their archives, and prepared to leave. As a final act, Cale did not take a physical sample. Instead, he directed a pulse of pure, coherent empathy back into the land, a gesture of acknowledgement. It was a gentle energy, a way of saying, "We heard you." The moment the pulse touched the ground, something extraordinary happened. For a single, fleeting second, the entire glen seemed to hold its breath. The bioluminescent moss dimmed. The wind died. And in that perfect, suspended silence, Cale and his team felt it, a single, clear, unified sensation that rose from the land itself. It was not a word, but a meaning. Release. Then the moment passed. The moss glowed again. The wind resumed its sigh. The echo was still there now, as if a burden had been lightly laid down. The listeners departed, carrying with them the last fading echo of Loch Dew. They had not uncovered a history. They had borne witness to a feeling. The story of the Kelpie and Elspeth, of Hamish and the Glen, was now truly over. Its final vibration recorded, and its spirit, at long last, granted a form of absolution by beings who understood that the universe is built not just of matter and energy, but of stories, and that even the oldest, faintest story deserves to be heard one last time before the final silence. The unending story. The departure of the listeners did not return the glen to silence. It bestowed upon it a new kind of quiet, one of resolution. The faint quantum echo they had measured and acknowledged had, in that final moment of empathetic contact, achieved a state of completion. The tangled knot of emotions, the hunger, the love, the betrayal, the fear, had been witnessed by a consciousness capable of holding it without being consumed. This act of cosmic listening had untangled the knot, allowing the individual strands to finally, gently dissipate into the hum of background reality. The story was no longer a trapped, repeating loop of sorrow imprinted on a location. It was a free memory, released back into the universe's vast reservoir of experience. The vibe of the place transformed. The lingering melancholy that had clung to the air and stone for eons, so subtle it was a part of the weather, simply evaporated. What remained was a pure, potent neutrality. The basin was no longer a grave, a shrine, or a monument. It was, once again, simply a place, a geographical formation of stone and soil subject only to the impartial forces of geology and biology. The wind that swept through it carried no ghosts, only the scent of bioluminescent moss and cold, thin air. The stream that trickled across its floor was just water, seeking the path of least resistance, its journey devoid of metaphor. The legacy of the Kelpie, of Elspeth, of all who had come and gone, did not vanish. It underwent a final, profound metamorphosis. It ceased to be a specific legend tied to a specific patch of water and became something far greater and more diffuse. It became a part of the pattern. The specific, heartbreaking tale of a water horse and a lonely girl was lost to time, but the essential truths it contained, the danger of beautiful deceptions, the universal ache of loneliness, the transformative power of love and loss, the enduring search for connection, these were universal constants. They were the fundamental emotional materials from which all stories are built. In a city of light, on a world orbiting a distant star, Kyle curated the archives. The data packet from the place once called Loch Dew was not filed away as a mere curiosity. It was studied, not for historical facts, but for its emotional complexity. The intricate weave of the Elspeth strand became a teaching tool for young listeners, a masterclass in the archaeology of feeling. They learned to recognize the harmonic resonance of tragic love, the corrosive frequency of isolation, the sharp, clean note of sacrifice. They did not learn about a girl named Elspeth. They learned about the category of experience she so perfectly embodied. In this way, the story achieved a form of immortality. It was no longer a narrative to be told, but a fundamental chord in the symphony of sentient experience, a reference point for understanding the emotional spectrum of the universe. The Kelpie, the ultimate predator of intimacy, and Elspeth, its ultimate victim and catalyst, had become archetypes. Their specific identities dissolved into the eternal forms they represented. Back on Earth, the planet continued its slow, cosmic journey. The glen endured. The basin, filled with sediment, was scoured by ice and was filled again. Millions of years later, a new body of water formed there, not from glacial melt, but from a shift in an underground aquifer. It was a small, clear, unremarkable lake, home to insects and simple aquatic plants. It had no name. It held no secrets. Children of a new, rudimentary species that had risen in the absence of humanity would sometimes swim in its cool, placid waters, their laughter echoing against the same mountains that had once witnessed such profound sorrow. They felt nothing of the past. They were simply living their own new stories in a world blessedly free of the old one's ghosts. The history of Scotland, of mankind, of the Kelpie itself, was now a layer of compressed strata deep beneath the lake's bed, a footnote in the planet's long geological memoir. The specific was subsumed by the general, the personal by the universal. And yet, A concept exists in transdimensional physics, understood by the listeners, which posits that information is never truly destroyed. It merely changes its state, its location, its expression. The story of Loch-Du, in its most essential form, the data of its events, the energy of its emotions, was not gone. It was part of the cosmic background radiation, a whisper in the dark matter that binds the galaxies. It was in the spin of every electron, the dance of every quantum particle. It had become a part of the fundamental isness of reality. So, when a lonely soul on a distant world looks up at a strange constellation and feels an inexplicable pang of sorrow and beauty, they are touching a fragment of the story. When a creator, in a moment of inspiration, captures a feeling of tragic love so perfectly it breaks and mends the heart simultaneously, they are channeling a vibration that once pulsed from the heart of a black Scottish loch. When any being anywhere understands the terrible cost of a lie wrapped in beauty, or the profound relief of being truly seen, they are walking a path that was paved, in part, by a girl who trusted a monster, and a monster who, in its own way, trusted her back. The story ended in the glen. It ended with the drying of the water and the scattering of the bones. It ended with the listener's final empathetic pulse. But stories, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed. The tale of the Kelpie of Loch-Du is over, but it is also unending. It continues in the silent, unseen connections between all things that feel and love and lose and remember. The water's false heart is still. The legend is complete, but the echo of its truth ripples outward forever, a permanent, invisible thread in the infinite tapestry of all that ever was and all that ever will be. Epilogue: The Stone and the Star. A single, smooth, gray stone rests in the center of the new, nameless lake. It is not the same stone that the young engineer David placed at the water's edge in a forgotten age. That stone was washed away and ground to dust eons ago. This is another stone, one of countless millions, resting on the silt of a new epic. A faint, filtered sunlight penetrates the clear water, dappling its surface. This stone has no memory. It does not know that it lies in a basin that once held a much darker, deeper body of water. It does not know that a creature of immense power and sorrow once swam here. It does not know that a human heart shattered into this very earth. The stone simply is. It is a part of the planet, subject to its rhythms, waiting for the next geological turn that might lift it back to the air or bury it deeper in the dark. High above, in the deep, velvet black of space, a star reaches the end of its life. It has burned for billions of years, a steady beacon in the void. Now, its fuel exhausted, it begins to collapse inward upon itself. The process triggers a cataclysm of unimaginable force, a supernova. For a few brief weeks, this dying star outshines its entire galaxy, a final magnificent shout of light and energy before it winks out, leaving behind a dense, dark remnant. The wave of energy from this event, traveling at the speed of light for millennia, finally reaches the solar system. It washes over the Earth, a silent, invisible tide of radiation and fundamental particles. It passes through the atmosphere, through the new lake, through the water, and through the smooth, gray stone at its bottom. For a quantum instant, the information contained in that stellar wave, the entire life history of the star, its composition, its death throes, interacts with the atomic structure of the stone. In that impossible, fleeting moment, the story of the star and the story of the stone are intertwined.
The stone is imprinted with a ghost of the star's light, and the receding energy wave carries away an infinitesimal vibration from the stone, a vibration that contains, buried within its atomic signature, the faint, ghostly resonance of a place that was once called Loch Dew. The stone remains, unaware. The star is gone. But the connection was made. The specific story of the Kelpie is now woven into the epic story of a star's death, its echo carried outward on a wave of light into the infinite cosmos. So it goes. Stories end, and in their ending, they become part of a larger story. They become the soil from which new stories grow. They become the light by which new stories are read. They become the silence between the notes of a song that has no beginning and no end. The glen is quiet. The water is still. The story is told.